Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the committee's 8th meeting in 2021. Could I ask everyone please to make sure their mobile phones are on silent? And just to say that this meeting will be conducted in virtual format. Now, we have received apologies from Maureen Watt, the Deputy Convener, and should anything happen to my reception, it has been agreed that Stuart Stevenson will stand in. Christine Graham is attending as Maureen Watt's substitute, and I would like to do some declarations regarding interests prior to the meeting. And I'm going to start that off to say that I would like to declare that I'm a member of a family farming partnership in Murray, and I have a wild salmon fisheries interest in Speyside. Peter Chapman, I think you want to make a declaration. Peter.
Thanks, Convener. Likewise, I declare an interest in a farming partnership in Aberdeenshire.
Thank you very much. And I have declarations also from Stuart Stevenson, Jamie Halcrow-Johnson and Angus MacDonald. So Stuart Stevenson, please.
I'm the joint owner of a very small registered agricultural holding from which I derive no income.
Thank you, Stuart. Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thank you, Convener. I'm also a partner in a farming business.
Thank you very much. And Angus MacDonald. Angus.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. In relation to later questions, I should declare that I own properties in a Crofting township in the Outer Hebrides. However, I derive no income from these properties.
Thank you very much, Angus. First item on the agenda is agricultural fisheries. And this, I'd like to welcome to the committee Fergus Ewing, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Economy and Tourism, John Kerr, the Head of Agricultural Policy Division, George Burgess, the Deputy Director of Food and Drink, and Jane McPherson, the Team Leader for Catching Policy and Future Fisheries Management for the Scottish Government. Cabinet Secretary, I'd like to invite you to make a brief opening statement. Cabinet Secretary.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for this invitation to address you today on an update for the agricultural and rural economy portfolio. Before I do so, I wanted to highlight the following areas specifically to the committee. Firstly, Scotland's forestry sector is a very positive area of the rural economy, not only because throughout the pandemic, the forestry sector has continued to provide essential wood and timber products, but also due to the tremendous successes that have been achieved over the last 5 years. We've completed fully the devolution of forestry, improving accountability and performance. We've doubled our woodland creation and also doubled the output of Scotland's tree nurseries. Large companies have invested over £140 million of private capital into the sector, but also we've helped over 100 crofters improve their land with trees. Forestry is a key growth area for the future in rural Scotland, and I'm happy to expand on that later. And I do want to take this opportunity, Convener, to pay tribute to everybody working in the sector, both public and private, who are out there right now working hard to deliver our planting targets. Despite this year of adversity with COVID, Brexit, and heavy and persistent snow at the beginning of 2021, I'm very pleased this morning to be able to inform the committee that we are on track to meet our target of 12,000 hectares of new woodland. There are in fact 13,000 hectares of projects approved for this financial year and over 6,000 hectares for the following year. So the pipeline remains strong, and that truly is a remarkable achievement. Turning to fisheries, as we implement our future fisheries management strategy, we will consider the scope of the UK Fisheries Act 220 alongside other legislation and substantive vessel licensing powers already in place, to determine whether additional legislation may be required in order to support sustainable and responsible fishing management, including for the inshore sector. We will, of course, work in partnership with our stakeholders to do that. And finally, on frameworks, currently 7 frameworks that are in REC's remit are operating at official level on an interim basis across the UK. An additional framework on organic farming is currently undergoing the provisional approval process. In conclusion, I expect these frameworks to be developed further amongst the coming months and formally to be scrutinised by the Scottish Parliament from September onwards before they are finalised and approved by all 4 administrations. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for that opening statement. We have a series of questions, actually quite a lot of questions that members want to ask you, Cabinet Secretary. So again, as I always implore, short answers and short questions go well together. And Colin Smith is going to start off with the first question. Colin.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and good morning to your officials. The Agriculture Retained EU Law Data Scotland Act is now obviously on statute. So, Cabinet Secretary, can you tell us how that legislation has so far been used to simplify or improve the operation of CAP legislation, and what plans does the current government have to make further changes in the short term? I mean, is there, for example, any sign of the pilot schemes that are now allowed under the legislation?
Well, thank you. And we have put these powers to good use, as we had planned for prior to the legislation. There's a number of ways we've done that, Mr. Smith. We've removed the crop diversification requirement from greening from 221. We've made improvements to inspections for 221 by kind of refocusing resources to focus on improving compliance through support and better targeting of inspections. We've also made improvements to the penalty regimes, which I think many people, certainly myself, felt involved disproportionate penalties. And we've reinstated LFAS payments to 100% for the scheme year 221, something that I think was popular. So these are some examples. The second question, well, we are proceeding with pilots at the moment. Nature Scott is, we are in respect of a forestry pilot, for example, which is underway. We're also working with farmer-led groups, which I'll maybe park because perhaps it might be the subject of substantive questions later. So I would say a great deal of progress has been made, and in summary, I think all of these things, inspections, penalties, the removal of the crop rule, these are things that really the farming community was asking for quite a long time.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. You're correct. The farming groups will be part of the questions later. In fact, my colleague is about to ask questions on that at the moment. So just to open that discussion, looking at future policy, Cabinet Secretary, it is more than 2 years since Parliament agreed to establish what subsequently became the Farming and Food Production Future Policy Group. The Scottish Government website still says their remit is to make recommendations for future policy development and I quote, the course of 2020. Now, we've not seen any of those recommendations yet, but you've obviously seen a draft from the group. So what is your response to what they are proposing, and when are we likely to see exactly what that particular group is proposing? Because the clock is ticking towards 2024, and I don't think there's a farming and environment stakeholder anywhere happy with the progress from the government in setting out future policy.
Well, I don't agree with the last statement, but in response to the main question, could I say that this group was established, as quite rightly so, as an independent group. In other words, it wasn't a Scottish Government advisory group. It was a group that was really set up precisely to conform with the exact requirements as set out in a parliamentary motion and amendment, which was, as I recall, tabled by Mr. Rumbles. And therefore, I think it is important just to make the point that this is an independent group, and it would be quite wrong for me to instruct it. Now, perhaps because of COVID and Brexit, the group hasn't finished its work or reached its conclusions, but I don't really think it's for me to order them to do so, because it is by definition an independent group, and it also represents various strands of stakeholders and so on, and it was not for me to exert any pressure of individual members of the group in respect of their appearance on the group in respect of stakeholders. So it's really up to the group to determine whether or not it is able to report. But in the meantime, I do wish to stress to the committee that we have our climate change plan, we have our farmer-led groups in place. The Beef Suckler Climate Report by Jim Walker and Claire Simonetta was published at the end of October last year. And I do think that we're making very substantial progress now, now that Brexit has clarified some aspects and we're able to see beyond Brexit to some extent. And I can come on to answer questions on the progress we're making there and then if convener, your committee so wishes.
Thank you. Colin, do you want to push on that, or I'm happy to bring in Mike Rumbles?
Can I just follow up on that, though, Cabinet Secretary? What was it from the Food and Food Production Futures Policy Group's draft that prompted you to then go off and set up a whole range of other farming groups?
No, I've always believed that the Scottish Government needed to take our initiatives in order to tackle climate change and to look beyond Brexit. And I made no secret of that. And indeed, the pledge for farmer-led groups was contained in our programme for government. It's been there for members to quiz me on, to raise questions about for a very considerable length of time. But also, I think there's a more important question, and this is very important, I think, to understand. We are going to be asking farmers and crofters and land managers to change considerably the way they farm and to farm ever more sustainably to tackle our ambitious, challenging climate change targets. To do that, I was determined to make sure that the ways in which change was required were discussed and brought forward by farmers themselves, because I feared that if we were to impose top-down from politicians, academics and civil servants a set of policies, they might well be resisted. And therefore, to get buy-in for what we must do in tackle climate change, I believe that asking farmers themselves to take and share responsibility for policy development was actually the only practical way that this can work. Because, quite rightly, in my opinion, farmers are very resistant to being told what to do by people out with their farm who do not know their land as they do. And secondly, I think that who best to persuade farmers and crofters to change than other farmers and crofters? So, I spent 13 years in government convener, and I've always been of the view that we should work on a Team Scotland basis, and that applies to policy formulation. And in this case, I have to say that the work that farmer-led groups are doing is exemplary. I've been in close contact with many of the leaders of the groups, and the progress they're making is significant. Reports are expected before Purda, in some cases, I hope, certainly in the spring. And I do believe that proceeding this way, putting farmers, if you like, in charge of their destiny, is actually the only way, a sine qua non of, if you like, of making the progress that we all want to see in tackling climate change.
Colin.
So Cabinet Secretary, you've sidelined the Farmer and Food Production Future Policy Group because you didn't like the draft, and you've set up other groups. I mean, presumably you could have set those groups up at the very start, but you waited until you'd seen a draft from the Future Policy Group. Is that not the case?
No, that's not the case. I set up the process of farmer-led groups some considerable time ago, and as regards to say that I sidelined the report is completely and utterly wrong. It's an independent report, and it is completely inappropriate that I should seek to direct or instruct that because it is an independent report. So nobody has sidelined them. If they're able to produce the report before Purda, then we will study it, of course, and we will study it very carefully. But if that doesn't happen, then we do have our very clear plan in place. I referred to the climate change plan. Mr. Smith didn't mention that. That sets out a number of things that we have to do. My job then was to turn that into an action plan, and that's exactly what I'm doing.
I do have questions on the climate change plan, Cabinet Secretary, but I know other members want to come on this other issue first before I ask them.
Okay. Peter, you want to come in? Peter Chapman.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, I absolutely agree that getting buy-in from the farming community is very important. But you have to recognise that farmers have been crying out for a plan for at least the last 2 years, I would argue. NFUS and SLE and farmers themselves are ready for change and accept that change is coming. But do you not accept that you're moving far too slowly? The industry thinks you're moving far too slowly. I think the only person that doesn't think they're moving far too slowly is yourself. If we are, as an industry, to meet the targets that are there for climate change by 2030, we need a plan before 2024. So my question to you, Cabinet Secretary, is do you not accept the industry is correct and you are wrong and you are far too slow in bringing forward the route map that this industry desperately needs.
Well, with respect, I just don't accept any of that at all. In fact, I've had scarcely any letters to that effect from farmers, convener, over the past 3 years to say there's a clamour. If there were a clamour, I would have been inundated with correspondence to that effect. I haven't. There's been nary an email. What farmers have wanted is stability and certainty and confidence that their payments, including to yourself, have been received on time. We've fixed that. We've sorted that. I said I would in 2016, and we have fixed it. Not only that, but actually Scottish farmers have received their Pillar 1 payments via effectively de facto advance payments in the form of loans 2 or 3 months earlier than anywhere else in the UK. So I think what farmers wanted is for us to do our job, and they're quite entitled to, and we've done that job by making payments. Secondly, I led and won the Convergence campaign, which has given a big boost to farmers throughout the country, particularly in the less productive areas, which is why we got the Convergence monies in first place. Thirdly, I actually think that the enthusiasm of the farmers that are participating in the farmer-led groups is manifest. It's palpable. It's a good thing. I mean, I genuinely do hope that other parties will support this as actually the modus operandi of the way ahead. Next, the work I have done, and I referred to in respect of Mr. Smith's answer on alleviating penalties, on reducing inspections, on abolishing the crop diversification rule, on confirming that LFAS will revert to 100% for next year. And incidentally, it would be my hope that we would keep it at that level until 2024. And the Hill Farming, Upland and Crofting Group is also tasked with giving us advice about an LFAS replacement. I think all of these are the practical things, convener, that count to farmers. So this narrative that the Conservatives in Scotland have been concocting is just not based by the facts, genuinely not based on the facts as far as I can see, and therefore is almost irrelevant. And on the contrary, I think the farming community, now that Brexit has been, if you like, upon us, rightly or wrongly, it is now the time to make progress. Lastly, we're not waiting till 2024 for a new system. I believe we will gradually put it in place. Well, he answered several questions.
Cabinet Secretary, I've given you a lot of leeway in that answer, and I am going to try, because there are so many questions, to focus you in. I'm going to bring Jamie Halcrow-Johnson in, and then I'm going to go to Richard Lyle. Jamie.
Thank you very much, convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Just in response to your response to Peter Chapman, at AgriScot only in November, Andrew McCormick, the then NFUS president, said, and I quote, "Where is the policy? Where is the roadmap? All the information you need is sitting on waiting on Scottish Government desks to be pulled together. Stop dithering and start delivering." Is that not the NFUS clamouring for answers on future rural policies, Cabinet Secretary?
Well, you picked one phrase from his speech, if that was what he actually said at the time. I can't recall the exact words, but I would say that we work very closely and quite rightly so with NFUS. Martin Kennedy actually is the co-chair of the Hill Farming, Upland and Crofting Group, along with Joyce Campbell. And as I understand it, he and his colleagues in the NFUS, whom I'm meeting again pre-Purdah, meeting the board pre-Purdah, are largely signed up to the process of farmer-led groups. I would also point out, Mr. Johnson, no one else has mentioned this thus far, that the UK government has unilaterally reduced our budget to 225 by £170 million. It's very difficult to make a plan until you know what your budget is. And at the moment, it's been reduced by 170 million, along with reductions to Wales and Northern Ireland's budget. So I'm still waiting to know whether Mr. Johnson, as the spokesman for the Conservatives, will join me in campaigning for restoration of that cut, because it would certainly help us deliver any plan for the future.
Right. I'm going to go to Richard Lyle now for some questions, I believe, on forestry. Richard.
Yes. Can I get on to a positive issue now, Cabinet Secretary? Can I welcome your announcement, planting As you know, during my time in Parliament, I've continually advocated more tree planting. My thanks go to forestry personnel for what they've done. Instead of 12,000 hectares, you're now going to plant 13,000. That's 80% of UK planting. So could I ask, what discussions are you having with other nations to increase their planting? Because their planting is abysmal compared to Scotland.
And Cabinet Secretary, could you just clarify as well that what Richard Lyle has said is correct, that you will be planting 13,000 hectares this year, just so they do party.
13,000.
13, yes, 13.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'll just repeat what I said earlier, Convener, because I made it very clear. I said there are 13,000 hectares of projects approved for this financial year, and therefore we're on track to meet our target of 12,000.
Okay.
And the actual audited figures will be available later in the year, but I thought it correct to inform the committee that we are on track to meet our target. We always aim a bit over the actual target because there is always an element of slippage. And of course, this year, my goodness, we've seen Brexit, COVID, and persistent snow during the period, which, as you know, is the planting season. So we are on track for our target, and I want to be absolutely precise about that. But it is, Convener, twice that of the rate of total new plantings, which was applicable back in 2015-16, as I recall. So I do think it's correct to pay tribute to everybody involved in forestry. And Mr. Lyle is absolutely correct that we aim to further increase that to 18,000 hectares. And indeed, some have argued that we can go further. And I think that we have the capacity in Scotland, we have the landmass asset to go further. It's very important we take farmers and crofters with us. We're setting out our intention to deliver further schemes building on the success that we've got. Many schemes are already going to farms and smaller landowners. And as far as the question goes about other jurisdictions, I mean, plainly, England and Wales are by and large, are more densely populated than Scotland and don't quite have the capacity to do what we do. But Zach Goldsmith, the UK minister, did actually seek my advice about what he thought was an excellent performance in Scotland. And I was very pleased that he was honest enough to recognise that we've made very, very substantial progress indeed. And it's not only the planting sector, the sawmill panel products sector is very important to the Scottish economy. And I think it's an area of real potential growth in the future, Convener. But I'll stop there because I see that you want to make progress.
I do. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I'm briefly going to go back to Colin Smith because there was a question that I think he wanted to ask, and then I'm going to go to Emma Harper. And if I could just remind members that I'm watching carefully the chat box to try and bring people in at the right time, and you will need to watch to see where I'm going to bring you in to try and make this as seamless as possible. Colin, followed by Emma Harper.
Thank you very much, Convener. Obviously, climate change planet is important. As I mentioned earlier, I had a question on this when the Cabinet Secretary mentioned it. There has been Cabinet Secretary unanimous criticism of the Scottish Government's decision to cut the agri-environment climate scheme by 20%. In fact, I think almost all stakeholders have criticised this move. So, Cabinet Secretary, can I ask you how the gap that will be left by this cut will be filled in the short term before we do move to new policy post-2024?
Well, I mean, I don't really accept the characterisation of unanimous, but I would point to the £170 million cuts, and I do hope the Labour Party support my campaign to restore that. A third of the CAP schemes, including greening, AICS, beef efficiency, forestry grant scheme, are providing funding in this area. We have also, in addition, provided funding for the Agri Transformation Programme. We have prioritised agri-environment support in the face of significant cuts. As it stands, we stand to lose 170 million over the period. The AIC scheme was reopened for a targeted range of options in January 2021. It does support, broadly speaking, the same range of land under stewardship in respect of the agri-environment scheme. But, you know, I say again, Mr. Smith, you know, if Scotland will campaign as one to get the money we were promised pre-Brexit by the Brexiteers, the funding would be at least matched post-Brexit. We need this money back. And I will be arguing very forcibly in the coming weeks and months that this is a major issue for Scotland, and I do hope that we can have the kind of united campaign that we had in the convergence money latterly, which led to its success.
Colin, does that answer your question?
Oh, just briefly, Cabinet Secretary, the NFU, Scottish Environment Link, and many others have criticised the cut. If that's not unanimous, could you tell us any organisation or anyone who's supported your decision?
Well, I think that there was fairly widespread recognition that the problems that we faced meant that the decisions that we took were practical and effective ones. Certainly, I understand that Nature Scot have welcomed the commitment to have a further round of AICS. There was a welcome of the fact that we carried over funding from the previous round to continue spending. Of course, we will continue the AICS spending until 2025. So I think to categorise the opposition as total and monolithic is somewhat over-egging the cake. But I go back to the point. I mean, if we had not had a 170 million cut foisted on us, with no consultation, I may add, then obviously we could use some of that enhanced funding to do even more. And if the other parties want to support me, then that surely would do nothing but help me win that campaign, along with the administrations in Wales and Northern Ireland who are making precisely the same case.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. So, Colin, in answer to your question, Nature Scot is the only one. Emma Harper.
Everybody, good morning, Cabinet Secretary.
You were muted. Sorry, I now hear you.
Okay, thanks. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I think this might be the fourth week in a row that we've seen you at committee here. I've just got a quick question about common frameworks. We received a copy of a letter where Mike Russell, Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, said that many of the common frameworks would be scrutinised in September 2021 in the next parliamentary session. So, Cabinet Secretary, do you have any reflections on the common framework process, given the fact that many of the frameworks have been, or elements of the frameworks have been implemented already, such as primary and secondary legislation? I know how many of the frameworks are really difficult and take up a lot of work. We've seen that with Health and Sport Committee as well. So do you have any reflections on the common framework process?
Well, the frameworks are kind of developed to agree joint ways of working between the four governments in policy areas where there's a devolved kind of intersect. So they have been designed to manage divergence, in other words, recognising that the devolved administrations can take their own decisions in areas such as agriculture and fisheries. And the provisional operation frameworks are, as Emma Harper says, in operation at official level on an interim basis. And all legislatures will have the opportunity to scrutinise them before they're finalised. I think I did make that point in my opening remarks. As a matter of form, it's absolutely important that Parliament that we are accountable to Parliament, as are the UK government through ourselves. Just my own reflection is that the framework is one thing, but unless we are properly consulted before decisions are taken, the frameworks are a sham. And we were not consulted about the 170 million. We were not consulted about the absurd concessions that were made with regard to fisheries in the Brexit negotiation. We were not consulted about major things. We were not consulted about the UK's various U-turns in the sad history of the impacts on seafood following Brexit. So without proper consultation, which they say will happen, but actually very rarely happens, the frameworks are nothing but words on a page.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The next questions are for Jamie Halcrow-Johnson. Jamie.
Thanks very much, Convener. We're all very aware of the issues, challenges that face some of our exporters, and as the Cabinet Secretary mentions, the fisheries sector has had particular issues since the end of the transition period. Can I ask what progress has been made in resolving some of those export challenges for food producers more generally, and also what the outcome of the initial discussions with the Scottish Seafood Exports Task Force have been.
Yeah, well, Mr. Halker-Johnson refers to an extremely serious turn of events, which is that since Brexit, the seafood sector in particular, but actually the whole agriculture sector has been very adversely affected by Brexit, and particularly the new additional bureaucratic processes that have been introduced affecting most obviously the seafood sector, and these have had devastating consequences. But also seed potatoes can no longer be exported. And also I heard yesterday that a carrot exporter to Northern Ireland has lost business because his customer in Northern Ireland said that the additional paperwork means that the business is no longer worthwhile. And I think that particular story is being publicised by the Farmers Guardian. So and also there has been problems with exports of certain meat products to Northern Ireland. What progress is being made on these issues? We are working hard. I mean, Food Standards Scotland, Scottish Government officials, including Mr. Burgess, who's on this call, the three hubs that were set up in Scotland to help address the coming maelstrom of bureaucratic impasse. These have all been working around the clock, and I'm very proud of the huge efforts they've been done. And Ian McWatt of FSS has really got this by the scruff of the neck. But the complexity of the EHCs, the interaction with customs documentation, the practical difficulties about importation and agency, coupled with the logistical issues of transportation during a COVID pandemic, I mean, they really have created very serious problems, as I think everybody has said. The task force that was set up is working to try to address some of these issues, and we are working constructively along the process. I receive daily reports about the length of time it takes, for example, to process EHCs, and progress is being made, but I'm afraid it is still such that one of the worries is that smaller exporters, particularly those who have to use groupage consignment, are finding that the costs of the process are actually making unprofitable the continuance of the trade. And I do genuinely fear, Mr. Johnson, that is a real worry. I've mentioned carrots. I could mention other examples of small traders and shellfish just deciding to discontinue exportation because the former profit margin has been more than used up, if you like, for the cost of the Brexit bureaucracy.
Thanks very much for that answer, Cabinet Secretary. I know in previous discussions, and I'm trying to remember whether it was this committee or whether it was the European Committee that I sit on, there had been evidence given by somebody who was suggesting that potentially having a capped fee, I suppose, for particularly smaller producers in helping with some of those certificates. I don't know if that's something that's been considered. Can I move on very quickly? Just move on to another kind of part of this. At the Europe Committee, we had the Chairman of the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, David McAllister, MEP, giving evidence. He offered to help where problems arose that were on the EU side, which has been generally acknowledged that there have been issues around some of the perhaps inconsistencies in terms of border checks within different EU nations. Can I ask for what interaction or what engagement there has been with by the Scottish Government with the EU Commission or with the European Parliament in addressing some of these issues, which can be as ridiculous as wrong-coloured ink or simply customs officials in certain European or EU countries not knowing or not following what is quite clearly a standard law across the EU?
Well, you know, our Brussels office and our officials there are in daily contact with their counterparts, and there's informal discussion. But as Mr. Johnson, the committee knows, the formal legal responsibility and indeed the duty rests with the UK to, if you like, make progress with the EU Commission in particular. These problems are largely operational problems, and they result because, and we did warn both Mr. Eustace and Mr. Gove of this repeatedly, that the imposition of a brand new bureaucratic system would bound to lead to tears. And, you know, James Withers, Scotland Food and Drink, and all the Scottish stakeholders, I think, or virtually all, wrote on the 1st of November, saying that there needed to be a period of grace or a period of 6 months during which the former system would apply in order to learn to adapt a new system before it came into formal effect. And the UK never asked for that. I mean, it says that it wasn't available, but actually it never actually asked for that.
No, I recognise the politics of the situation.
Well, that's not the politics, that's pragmatics.
Well, I was asking about, I mean, these are areas which have been raised where there is, as I say, the EU nations aren't following the EU's import procedures, and are you suggesting that the Scottish Government can't help with that or can't work with that? That would only be a UK issue, or can the Scottish Government help with some of these issues?
Well, obviously we use our connections to try to make progress, but we are where we are because of Brexit, Mr. Johnson. And we, for example, have in the seed potato issues through Professor Sadler and other officials with whom I've worked extremely closely to try to have the removal of this ban on seed potatoes. We left no stone unturned, including appropriate communication with European bodies, the European representative bodies, to ensure that representations were made not just to the Commission, but also to individual countries who have trade with us on seed potatoes. That's just one example where we've gone out of our way. No stone has been left unturned to do these things. The point I'm making, I'm afraid, is a very simple and factual point, that we are where we are because of Brexit, because of the way the UK government chose to do Brexit, despite warnings that it would lead, frankly, to the difficulties we have seen. I mean, ironically, Brexiteers wanted to scrap red tape. It's led to red tape instead.
Yeah, I think we're just going over old ground here. I mean, the question really was about the practical work that the Scottish Government could do on areas where even the EU accept that perhaps their own rules are being followed, but not being followed. Okay, can I move very quickly on to another issue around import checks into Scotland? At the recent meeting of the Europe Committee, we had Mark Thompson from Dumfries and Galloway Council talking about Ken Ryan, which is obviously, is looking for Port Health Authority status. One of the concerns he raised was the funding needed to get that status. And when I asked him who would pay if the Scottish Government didn't provide additional funding, his answer wasn't that it would necessarily be the council. It was that they might not be able to provide those services at Ken Ryan. I know that Joan Calpine, as the convener of that committee, has written to Mike Russell about this. Can you tell? I mean, are you able to give us any update on Scottish Government support for Dumfries and Galloway Council to get that Port Health Authority status? And if it doesn't get that funding, what would be the impact of not having that status at Ken Ryan?
Well, it is essential that post-Brexit, Ken Ryan should be a border control post. And the reason for that is if it doesn't have that status, it will gradually kind of possibly wither on the vine in terms of trade, because traders will go else, they will use other border posts, even although the proportion of goods imported, exported that will be subject to the border controls may be small. The traders will go choose elsewhere because of administrative convenience. That's the worry. So I've been arguing for over the last year prior to Brexit that we must get a border control post. Now, bear in mind, I mean, Mr. Johnson is asking we should pay for it. Well, it's reserved. Customs is reserved. Border control posts are within the gift of the UK. Now, the operation of the sanitary and phytosanitary checks are, yes, there for us. And they involve extra cost, actually, only because of Brexit. But let's be quite clear, convener, the responsibility for border controls is a reserved matter. And I've repeatedly asked Michael Gove if they will pay for this, and he has accepted that the UK should pay for it. So why on earth are the Scottish Tories asking the Scottish Government to pay for something which is palpably for the UK? I don't really understand, but my colleagues in the transport section are dealing with the issue day to day in respect of discussions with local authorities. That's not my purview. But the bigger question is who pays, and it should be London Government.
Well, can I then help clarify that? Because I wasn't asking about the border controls. I was asking about the Port Health Authority status, which is obviously delivered by the service delivered by the local council, and they're asking the Scottish Government for the support on that. So that's why it was a question to you. I appreciate it's not your sector, but have you had discussions with Mike Russell about this? And I mean, do you have any update that you can give us on whether that support will be forthcoming? Because as has been suggested by Dumfries and Galloway Council, if they don't have the additional funding to provide that, and obviously the Scottish Government have been provided 200 million for Brexit preparations, they may not be able to provide that service. And of course that has real implications for Scotland and for parts of the sectors under your control in terms of feed and other food products.
Well, I have had, of course, extensive discussions with Mike Russell, but it's not Mike Russell that's dealing with local authorities. He doesn't have that ministerial responsibility. I think I would like to bring in George Burgess, I think, who may be able to add a bit more, but we fully accept our responsibilities for sanitary and phytosanitary checks. And we have, and I know we have gone to great lengths in advance of the new arrangements coming into place to make sure that funding was available for the recruitment of individuals involved, and moreover, that although it's not my specific purview and responsibility, we have nonetheless been working with all relevant local authorities to that end. But I think, given Mr. Johnson has asked for a bit more detail, perhaps my officials can help, convener, with your permission.
Cabinet Secretary, no. I'm afraid I'd love to bring George in, but I am struggling for time because of the length of the questions and the length of the answers. Now, I want to bring Christine Graham in with a question. Cabinet Secretary, please don't shake your head with the greatest respect. I am trying to run this, but everyone gets a chance to answer the question. So, Christine Graham, you'd like to ask some questions, and if it's appropriate to bring George in at that stage, we'll do that. Christine.
Thank you, convener. Like Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, I'm on the European Committee, which is very handy as I'm substituting in this one, because the evidence, and this is on the fisheries industries and the farming industry, and what can be done now that we're out of the European Union, because the evidence we had was absolutely startling. Jimmy Buchan, Chief Executive of Scottish Seafood Association, on Brexit says these are not minor impediments to trade. The industry in Scotland is basically ground to a halt, and businesses that employ hundreds of people in communities around our coastline are losing money. Elspeth MacDonald, the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, said the UK government has not secured a good deal of fishing, so that benefit has not been delivered. In my opinion, we have ended up with the worst of the worst of the worst. And Claire Adam of the NFU Scotland said we're only at about 25% of...
Christine.
I'm coming to your question. I'm coming to the question. With the greatest respect...
No, Christine, sorry. With the greatest respect. I have asked for short questions, and yes. I've asked for short... And if I ask a question of that length in the chamber, I'm sure the presiding officer would call me to account. So I'm calling you to account and asking you to ask a short question. Here is my question.
Here is my question, that particular one. And I've listened to the length of other contributions from other members with respect. The issue to this is all of them say they are serious structural issues. I'm asking, what can the Scottish Government do if these are serious structural issues? And my second question is on the customs, because the Road Hauliers Association, and I know that the UK government refuted this, and that's perfectly entitled to do it, said there are 50,000 customs officers short, and that is causing huge issues and delays at ports and distribution centres. Would the Cabinet Secretary comment on these, please?
Briefly, Cabinet Secretary, please.
Briefly, and then I would be grateful if Mr. Burgess could add. I think it would be helpful. But briefly, my job is to try to make the best of things, to work with Jimmy Buchan, with Elspeth MacDonald. I meet with them frequently, and for my part, that's it. I could go into 5 or 6 things that we are doing to try to implement that, but I want to stress that although Brexit has been a complete disaster for fisheries, nonetheless, we're trying to make the best of it, convener, and that's my approach, because it's absolutely essential that we get back our fisheries sector that's so important to Scotland. But I would give up the rest of my time for Mr. Burgess, if I may.
Yes, well, I'm happy if you as you've kept a short answer to bring George in. George, if you'd like to come in briefly, please. Good morning.
Yeah, very briefly. On the matter of the border control posts, the draft development order published last week, my colleagues are working with the local authority and other stakeholders to ensure that a border control post can be established, and we are expecting that we will have to meet at least part of the bill for that. In terms of Mr. Howcroft-Johnson's question about engagement with European authorities, we're having regular dialogue with the French authorities, given that so much of our trade goes through the French ports, and that's helping to resolve the practical issues, ink, colour, stamps, and all the rest of it. We have also funded 2 posts in Seafood Scotland, working in Calais, helping resolve very practical problems at that end and speeding up the flow of goods. Thanks.
Thank you, George, for that answer. Christine Graham, you have a couple more questions you want to ask, and I would encourage you to be brief, please. Christine.
Oh, that will certainly take my lead from you, Convener. I'm just wondering, given the impact of TCA, and what impact has there been the impact of TCA and the development of policy and regulation for agriculture and land management, for example, in relation to the level playing field, which I think I was leading up to my previous question.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the effects of the TCA, including its interaction with other bits of legislation, such as the Internal Markets Act, will, I think, continue to unravel. And one potential example of this, which could have significant consequences, would be the effect on subsidy control in the UK. Most, but not all, agricultural subsidies, support payments, as I would actually prefer to call them, are exempt from the subsidy control provisions of the TCA and are covered by the WTO. And on 3rd of February, the UK government released a consultation on these areas, and it asks whether the subsidy should be subject to the new regime, despite being exempt in the TCA. So there are many potential implications, although it is early days yet to be categoric about it.
Thank you very much. No, that's absolutely fine. And the other one would be, following the passage of the UK withdrawal from the European Union, the Legal Continuity Scotland Act 2021, is the government intending to keep pace with the EU CAP regulations as it's changing ahead of the next CAP period, Cabinet Secretary?
Well, we do generally favour kind of alignment with the EU, and the reason for that is that the more we're aligned with the EU, the less risk there is of losing further trade, like the export of seed potatoes. The reason that seed potatoes are banned from export and we've lost that market because of Brexit is because the UK government refused to dynamically align, to accept that they would abide by the EU legislation. So that's just one example. And broadly speaking, we do think that for example, the EU CAP proposals to ensure a fair income to farmers, to increase competitiveness, to rebalance the power in the food chain, climate change, environmental care, vibrant rural areas, these are EU objectives. We share them, actually. So, we do think that broadly speaking, we should do that, yes. Thank you.
Can I just ask, as a supplementary, you keep mentioning and I do understand, again, the European Committee understands the loss of the seed potato export market. What's the value of that? Do you have that figure?
Well, the seed potato market for Scotland as a whole is hundreds of millions of pounds, and particularly markets such as Egypt are extremely valuable. And I don't have the precise figures in front of me, but I will revert to the committee with them. But we are talking millions of pounds, and that means that other markets will have to be found, and decisions are being made right now by seed potato growers, not to grow for that market any longer. It's tragic because our seed potatoes are regarded as the best in the world, and we've lost the market purely because of bureaucracy and the way in which Brexit has chosen to be implemented by the UK government. They could have avoided the loss of this if they'd wanted to, but it wasn't really important enough to merit even a discussion in the negotiations.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary.
Stuart Stevenson, yours are the next questions. Stuart.
Thank you, and I'll try and shorten the questions, Convener. I will make the observation in my constituency alone, seed potatoes are worth over 10 million a year. But I'll pass on that. Fisheries, and a colleague will deal with the committees and management strategy. So I'm just simply asking about how the negotiations on total allowable catch with the EU and other independent coastal states are going, and in particular what role the Scottish Government has in that, which is something, of course, that will not just benefit Scotland, but I believe, because of the expertise, benefit the rest of the UK being involved. Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the negotiations, as Mr Stevenson will know, are ongoing. I have to say that, you know, Brexit has exacerbated the complexities and difficulties in these negotiations. You know, I'm not sure that I'd want to go into too much detail here. I don't think that would necessarily be appropriate. But I think as a general term, I don't think anyone would doubt that Brexit has made these negotiations more difficult. And there is a particular loss which is really important in practical terms, which is to do with swaps. That, you know, under the CFP and the Brussels negotiations, the bilaterals, after the deals were done, producers' organisations could make swaps to ameliorate the deal and make practical arrangements to swap quota with others and other countries in other waters. And this was a very practical and useful method. Now, that cannot be done at this local level. It can only be done by a sort of intergovernmental process. And this is a massive loss. In addition to that, the actual details of the quota which will be available are such that in some cases we will be actually in some areas worse off than beforehand. So overall, I think the upshot is more difficult. At some point, Convener, I'd like to bring in officials just to supplement any answers I've had, just in case there are other points that it would be useful to bring to the attention of the committee. So I'll just stop there.
Cabinet Secretary, I think one of my colleagues may have a little more on swaps that they want to ask, although I suspect you may have answered some of the things and say. Let me just, you didn't speak to me about how the Scottish Government...
Stuart, sorry, can I just stop you there? I don't know if it's me or somebody else, but the Cabinet Secretary seems to have frozen. Is that me or you?
I don't think I've frozen, have I? I mean, I'm...
Okay, sorry, Stuart, keep going.
Right, I was just saying it would be helpful if we heard how the Scottish Government, either at official or ministerial level, is involved. But my final bit on this is the specialised committee on fisheries that relates to the governance of the trade and cooperation agreement. How are we involved in that one? And that's my final word before handing on to others.
Okay, well, the immediate priority is the annual negotiations and the setting of TACs to allow the quotas for 2021 to be set, giving the industry, you know, the factual certainty it needs to operate and manage its fishing opportunities for the remainder of the year. But given the protracted annual negotiations with the EU, the policy work to implement the elements of the TCA hasn't started yet in earnest. We would expect Marine Scotland to be fully engaged in the setting up of the specialised committee, particularly with our responsibility for fisheries management and expertise in quota management and the annual negotiations.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you.
I'm struggling with the internet. I cannot quite work out whether it's me or whether it's other people. But anyway, thank you, Stuart. If you can hear me, Peter Chapman, yours are the next questions. I'm turning my camera off till I can resolve it. And perhaps IT could see if they could help me. Thank you.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah. I mean, Cabinet Secretary, my question was on a international quota swaps, and you did address that to some extent with Stuart Stevenson, but I do realise it's now a much more difficult process. It's an intergovernmental process, as you rightly said. but that doesn't mean to say we don't try and start the process. So, I mean, can you tell me, is there any progress being made in allowing their international quota swaps to continue, sometime soon, I would hope? I mean, what's your take on where we are with that process?
Okay, well, and perhaps I could bring in Jim McPherson to answer the technical question, but I understand that the process involved really only kicks in after the deal is done, and the deal hasn't been done, so it's premature. Obviously, we'll try and make anything work, but the guys with the expertise, as I think Mr. Chapman knows, are in the producers' organisations, and they effectively won't be able to do what they used to do. I'm not involved with this, but my understanding is that. But maybe I could pass to Jim McPherson just to perhaps give a more technical answer to Mr. Chapman's question, which is a reasonable question to ask.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Just to add, really, I suppose that the Cabinet Secretary is completely right that the in-year mechanism is yet to be established through the TCA Special Committee for Fisheries, mainly because of that annual negotiation process. And I think that for us, it's more important to focus on the bilateral negotiations, as that's where the potential is for this kind of in-year process. And really that we don't want to get into the process of talking about negotiation swaps until that bilateral negotiations have concluded. I think the Cabinet Secretary is right in terms of the process. It's about concluding the bilaterals and then moving on to thinking about how the specialised committee will work.
Okay.
Sorry, Peter, just before we go any further, because of the appalling internet that I have, I'm going to have to drop off and reconnect. So I'm going to hand over the meeting to Stuart Stevenson to convene in my absence just while I reconnect. I'm sorry about this, but broadband doesn't really work in the Highlands. I will reconnect. Thank you.
Stuart, I have one more question.
I was just going to say, Peter, I think you've not yet finished.
I have one more question. Cabinet Secretary, in the expectation that in future we will receive extra quota for fish from our waters, have you given any thought to how any additional quota might be allocated to the inshore fleet? Is that something that has had any discussion at this stage, or what's your thoughts on that one?
Well, my thoughts are that the deal which was done has been analysed by Marine Scotland, and that analysis shows that the deal really hasn't been a very good deal for Scotland at all. Some areas will be worse off, others will be marginally better off. So whether or not in future there will be significant benefits is something that, frankly, on which the jury is out. And the particular provision of concern is that at the end of 5 years, that unless the deal then is renegotiated in a way that is acceptable to the EU, they can start to punish British fishermen by imposing tariffs, starting on fisheries products, including farm fish, but then moving on to other areas. So I think really it is a hypothetical question at the moment. We did, however, set out in our sustainable fisheries management policy the approach that we would want to try to take, and it's there for you to see. But I think our focus, Mr. Chapman, at the moment is really trying to get the best deal what we can through the outcome of the various 4 negotiations that are taking place with Faroe, Norway, and of course the EU and the UK. So that really must be our focus at the moment, rather than answering what I'm afraid are pretty hypothetical questions at the current time.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. That's me.
A very brief supplementary from Emma, please.
Temporary convener. It's just a quick sup, really, that my understanding regarding inshore fisheries and quota is that in the South Irish seas, where the Kirkcudbright fishermen fish for queen scallops, that quota was left out of the UK negotiations by the UK government. So therefore the Kirkcudbright fishermen can't fish for queen scallops in the South Irish Seas now. Is that something that can be addressed in the future so that the fishermen can fish the waters that they're used to fishing again?
Yes, I think that's correct. Perhaps I could bring in Jane McPherson just to answer the technical aspects of that question, please, Convener.
Apologies, Cabinet Secretary. I don't have the specifics in terms of that fishery, but I'm happy to follow up with the committee and get an answer for you, and we can correspond on that.
Okay, thank you. Is John Finney next? I'm looking at we're halfway through the questions and when happy. John Finney.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and officials. Cabinet Secretary, we're no longer on the Common Fisheries Policy. I wonder, could you outline for the committee what progress there's been made producing a joint fisheries statement and the timeline of when that draft statement might be shared with the 4 UK parliaments, please?
Sure. Well, the UK Fisheries administrations have agreed a timeline for completion of the joint fisheries statement. Have agreed a policy outline, and drafting is commenced on the early stages. So we will keep everybody engaged in the drafting through the community of interest ahead of a formal public consultation in winter this year to spring next year, with a final draft of the document laid before each legislature for comment and for adoption in winter 2022.
Thank you very much indeed, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, early in the parliamentary session, the Scottish Government undertook to bring in new inshore legislation. I wonder, could you comment on the status of that, please, and specifically with regard to 3 points, if I may. On the back of our sister committee, the Clare Marine Planning Inquiry, they recommended regional inshore fishery groups. So, for instance, will the Scottish Government commit to making RIFG statutory bodies? Another issue, please, relates to the discussion paper that the Scottish Government had on fisheries management, where they said they saw merit in introducing a significant low-impact trial. Can you see why that proposal was dropped, please? And finally, what will the Scottish Government's new fisheries strategy do to spatially manage inshore fisheries with regard to such things as scallop dredging and bottom trawling, please?
Okay, well, three quite big questions, I think. I mean, first of all, I think the desire to make progress in respect of an inshore fisheries bill was impeded both by Brexit, by COVID, and now, frankly, inshore fisheries is being impeded by Brexit. We have seen huge difficulties because of the cost of exports. And bear in mind, Mr. Finney will know that, exports of things like prawns and crabs, the Spanish, the Italian, the French markets were absolutely key. These were the valuable markets. So it's been, sadly, a very difficult time. To respond to the questions, just briefly, I think, because I've got no choice but to respond briefly. We work very closely with inshore fisheries groups, and we have excellent relationships with the vast majority of them. And I do think that the best way to manage fisheries is to manage them locally rather than from Edinburgh. So I do in principle think that. Quite how it should be set out in the statutory form, that's an important question that I don't want to prejudge. But generally speaking, I do think that the principle of local management is a good one. Secondly, the sustainable fisheries is at the heart of what we do. And I have said before, and I'll say again, that the work that I've ordered with the full support of fisheries sector for the installation of remote electronic monitoring equipment has the capacity radically to improve the successful spatial management of fisheries, because we can tell where fishing vessels are. And that can either convict or exculpate those who, are accused of improper fishing practices. And thirdly, of course, we seek to use pilots. We use a whole variety of pilots. I don't want to stray into territory where I might inadvertently comment on any matter which is sub judice at the moment. But we do have a very good record, I think, Mr. Finney, of working to trial various methods all around the coast, working with inshore fisheries groups and others who have an interest. So that will continue to form part of our general approach. And I would just finish by saying that, although there are some very controversial areas of contention, I think by and large, what you don't really hear about is the vast majority of inshore fishing, where people live and let live, they coexist, they recognise different needs, different practices, and we all want to make sure that the inshore fisheries area, which is highly regulated, is conducted in a sustainable fashion.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That's me, convener. Thank you.
We'll now move to Angus, who will be followed by Mike, and at this point I hand convenership back to Mr. Mike with us again.
Thanks very much, Chair. I'm jumping in.
Okay, thank you, conveners. Turning to the need for a joined-up approach to all marine sectors, the fisheries management strategy is set out in the context of a wider blue economy action plan. So what's the timescale for delivering this plan, and how will it link up to the fisheries management strategy?
Well, I do agree with McDonald's sentiments, and therefore we have committed just over £600,000 to our blue carbon research programme, and this also has leveraged significant match funding from Scottish research institutes and partners, and we are doing a lot of things to protect these habitats through, for example, the MPA network. So there's a lot more detail, but I think those are perhaps two main points.
Okay, thank you. So the timescale, do you have that detail?
Well, on MPAs, on 25th September, we designated the West of Scotland MPA, which is the largest in national waters in North East Europe, with an area of over 100,000 square kilometres. And this locks in protection for deep sea sediment, which has been shown to be an important blue carbon habitat. And many are priority marine features, which we're seeking to build on existing protections from the impact of human activities through the marine licensing process by adopting proposals to introduce fisheries management in our MPA network. In doing all of this, of course, we want to work with fishermen, with fisheries interests, to make sure that we're operating on a Team Scotland basis. And before setting MPAs, we have a proper, thorough and agreed analysis about the impacts that any future MPAs may have on particularly inshore fisheries interests, because after all, they've been there for centuries.
Okay, thanks, Cabinet Secretary. We know that the fisheries management strategy commits to an ecosystem-based approach to management. So what action does taking such an approach entail? And following on from the recent report of the TCPU, will considering a blue carbon form part of the ecosystem approach?
Well, management decisions, I think, should be taken not just in isolation, but in partnership with others. So decisions to fish a particular stock take account of environmental impacts, for example, impacts on the seabed alongside dependencies in the ecosystem. For example, where a particular species is dependent on a fish stock for their feed source. So I guess put kind of simply, we'll take fisheries management decisions in partnership, transparently, and taking account of best evidence and science in order to get to the best outcomes.
Okay, thank you, convener.
Thank you, Angus. Mike Rumbles, I think you've got the next question. Mike.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Yes, I'd like to focus my question on fish farming. And you'll be well aware of our report that we did in this Parliament on the future of fish farming and the regulation of fish farming. And when we had a review of that, and if I can just focus specifically on the issue of, first of all, planning, we felt it was really important that the problem was that when local authorities receive an application for a fish farm, they have to, in law, quite rightly, make the application decision on the actual application. And there seemed to be missing, our view in the committee was, there seemed to be missing a strategic view of where we could identify good places for fish farming and identify areas where it wasn't really appropriate for fish farming. And we during this Parliament, I think we got agreement on that, but when we reviewed it, there wasn't seeming much to happen. So, you know, we're now facing an election in May, and there's going to be a new government coming in, or maybe a renewed government or a new government coming in May. So how far have we got along the lines of addressing the issue of a strategic approach to planning on fish farming?
Yeah. Well, I think we have made significant progress, but it's still work in progress. So the renewed Parliament will have a legacy, a good legacy on which to build. We published a 10-year farmed fish health framework. We launched the Salmon Interactions Working Group. We've updated, and I updated Parliament in 2019 on actions to strengthen sea lice management, lowering reporting and intervention levels to 2 and 6 adult female lice per fish from 3 and 8, with a further reduction to 2 and 4 in 2021, unless there is evidence to the contrary. SEPA have launched a new regulatory framework and sector plan for fin fish. In addition to that, we've made improvements to the planning system. I think they went through the parliamentary process fairly recently. But I do think there is more work to be done. But there has been a great deal of work done in the fish health framework, which I think has taken things forward. And the industry is, and I think this is an important point to stress, that, you know, as well as the government, the industry has been investing very substantially on improving fish health, with investment in hatcheries extending to hundreds of millions of pounds. And of course, that means that the fish spend less time in pens out at sea and more time in hatcheries. So that in itself is a significant gain. And finally, convener, because I don't want to go on too long, we have banned the shooting of seals, the control of seals, and we're published a review in respect of ADDs. So I don't think we've been, you know, sitting in our hands doing nothing, but I do acknowledge Mr. Rumble's point that there is more to be done, and we are working particularly on the spatial management issue and guidance to planners, which I think would be of further value. But these are very complex and difficult areas, and my desire is to take as many people with us as possible in everything we do in this regard, which is not always easy.
If I could say, Cabinet Secretary, I accept what you're saying about all the initiatives and good initiatives that are happening and have happened, and changes to the regulatory system, for instance, with SEPA on specific issues. But my question really is the big picture. And it seems to me that the wheels are moving incredibly slowly, and we all want to, well, I assume everybody on the committee wants to support the fish farming industry as best we can, and we came to the view that the best way to do that was to have this strategic approach, and the law doesn't allow it to happen at the moment. And would you be putting this in a legacy paper for the incoming government to take forward? Yeah, amusing as it is. What I mean is either a renewed government or a different government. Just as the Parliament is producing these papers for the new Parliament, I assume the government will want to hand this over. It's a non-political issue, really. I mean, party political. It's really to try to get the best result here.
It's not impossible that I may have some part to play in a new government. I would certainly be hopeful of that, but that's up to the electorate. So really my job is to, as you say, pass on a legacy. And could I just add briefly that, I do think that we have recognised that in the location of fish farms, increasingly, the pattern that was followed in Norway is the correct one. Namely, that instead of having several thousand small pens, you have several hundred large pens, putting it bluntly, and that the fish are increasingly, the fish pens are increasingly located in high energy, perhaps slightly further out to sea, rather than inland lochs where there's particular, inshore sea lochs, which are the particular issues, and therefore that trend has been enabled by the lifting of the cap of 2,500 tons on per pen. So that has been enabled, but I think there's more work to be done to develop the system by which we can be confident that the larger pens located in, I think, for example, near Rum, there's some examples going on at the moment of which are in point. Coupled with that, the second point I make is that we haven't seen the innovation sites go ahead. And these are stimulated and encouraged in Norway because they're exempt from the system of charging for the issue of new licenses per 1,000 tons. For innovation sites, they don't have to pay the fee because the justification is they're trying out new methods. New methods, for example, of delimiting the discharge to the sea. And there are some which I would like to see tried in Scotland. So yes, I want to leave a legacy of saying there is a better way. The Norwegian example gives us lots of pointers. I'm not saying it's perfect or that we can follow it. Norway is not Scotland, Scotland is not Norway. But I think we can, looking across the water, learn from others and yes, guide the planners and the planning system better in order to achieve sustainable growth without detriment to environmental impacts. I think there is a majority in Parliament for that approach. That's the approach that I would like to bequeath to the renewed Parliament.
Thank you,
Christine Graham.
Yeah, I'm finished.
Sorry, I'm going to bring Christine Graham in with a question, please, Christine.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's a question regarding, to some extent, the Cabinet Secretary's preempted the question I was going to ask, which was, and I must declare an interest as the convener of the cross-party group on animal welfare, about the reduction of sea lice in farmed salmon, which is a horrible, horrible disease. Can I ask, therefore, given what the Cabinet Secretary has just said about the Norwegian model, and I've appreciated what he said about Scotland's not Norway, vice versa, if that kind of thing will be in the legacy paper for incoming Cabinet Secretaries and Ministers, because we really, so far as possible, wish to eradicate sea lice in farmed salmon for the sake of the welfare of the animals themselves, if not also the consumer.
Well, I'm not sure it's possible totally to eradicate sea lice, but I think we have certainly, and I've set out tighter strengthened sea lice management measures. So I think we have acted there, and I think that is a legacy. I should say I didn't commit to set out a legacy paper. I mean, I'm not sure whether this is a process across the board that ministers do that. I haven't committed to doing that. I do want to leave a legacy of work that work is in progress. And I would point out that we should also think of the health of the fish. I mean, yes. It is a crime under the 2006 Animal Health and Welfare Act, as Ms Graham will know, to cause unnecessary suffering to animals, and this generally applies to farm fish. And one live question now is that seals can no longer be controlled, and it is a fact, I think, that seals can cause anxiety and stress to fish when they approach or attack a cage. So, we do need to consider that. And one of the ways in which the industry is doing this is by, in the manufacture of pens, creating separate little kind of lay-by areas in the pens to which the fish can retreat to alleviate the stress they suffer. So the industry, again, is through technological development trying to tackle, Ms Graham, admitted concerns about the health of the fish as well as cetaceans, which is an important consideration.
Thank you.
Thank you. Emma Harper, I think you've got the next questions. Emma.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, just a couple of quick questions about food and drink. I'm sure we have some good news stories to tell regarding our businesses in Scotland. So, and as the Cabinet Secretary knows, I'm very supportive of local food and drink production, promoting the provenance. I'm keen to protect the PGI status of our fantastic food production in Scotland. So I'm wondering if the Cabinet Secretary can provide an update on when you plan to publish the statement of policy on food and any other good news stories that you can tell us about food and drink in Scotland.
Briefly,
well, I could tell lots of stories, but I don't think I've got the time. But you know, our food production is of high quality and increasingly produced sustainably. I think will provide further opportunities for a premium. The work will be led by the Ministerial Working Group, which I chair. This is to ensure a cross-cutting approach. It's an iterative process which will take account of the COVID pandemic. The views of stakeholders are important, and my officials have spoken to DEFRA about the stakeholder engagement. So we want it to be a broad approach. I think, Convener, the requirements to take immediate action, as we've discussed, because of the pandemic and indeed the alarming impacts of Brexit, have meant that this is really where I've asked my officials to direct their focus. But you know, we will certainly publish the statement of policy on food as soon as we can. I can't really give a date today because I think it's very important before we really publish it that we make sure that there has been the widest buy-in. And as I say, I want to involve DEFRA with that as well. So I think it will take some time, probably for the next session of Parliament, I think, Convener, but I can just double check and perhaps come back to members on that just to make sure, because this wasn't a particular question I'd anticipated coming up.
Emma, is that you complete?
Just a final quick sup, really, that apologies for asking a question that the Cabinet Secretary might not have been prepared for, but I'm assuming that as we develop our strategies for food production in Scotland, that it will strengthen the local economies and local communities in Scotland, so that the purpose is that we have a robust local food production supply chain.
Well, absolutely. We work to try to help primary producers, farmers, fishers, to get the best possible deal from retailers, from supermarkets. Done a lot of work there, very productive work, actually. We also want to see primary producers enabled to sell directly online. I think online is going to disrupt retail, not only in clothing and records and books, but also in food. I think that's an ongoing process. Farmers markets needn't just be located physically. They can be online. So I think there's potential there. We also need to continue the success we've had in the Food for Life programme to have more locally produced food in Scotland provided for our kids at primary school in particular to get a healthy diet. And above all, we want to value our farmers and fishers for the great work they do. And goodness me, if they hadn't continued during the pandemic, where would we have been? Where would the food on our plate have been? Where would we have been able to keep going as a society? So we owe them a great debt, I think.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Angus MacDonald, I think you've got some questions next. Angus.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Just waiting on my camera coming on. Thank you. Turning to crofting, clearly the committee was disappointed that any prospect of a crofting bill was dropped in this session due to the pandemic. But it's clear, however, that work continues behind the scenes, not least looking at addressing issues raised in the crofting law, some with a view to simplifying crofting law, which is long overdue. Now, we were expecting a national development plan for crofting to be published last autumn, but it doesn't seem to have been published as yet. So can you tell the committee, Cabinet Secretary, what is the status of the National Development Plan for crofting, and which non-legislative reform will this aim to address?
Okay, the National Development Plan for crofting will be published this Parliament. That's our intention certainly, and barring the unforeseen, that has always been my intention, and it remains my intention. So make that clear. And it does aim to safeguard crofting for future generations, building on achievements in the past and looking at the opportunities in the future, not least in respect of the environment and what crofters can do in respect of things like peatland restoration and forestry and the sustainable conduct of livestock farming. And the work that Martin Kennedy and Joyce Campbell are doing will, of course, include and consider how we can see more opportunities to crofters, particularly active crofters. So the plan, I hope, will be published fairly soon, because there ain't much time left.
Okay, yeah, we certainly look forward to seeing the plan in the next few weeks. But what legacy would you say this government's leaving in relation to crofting reform? And also, where is the legislative reform process at now, at the moment? And what are the priority next steps?
Well, I am particularly pleased that in crofting we have managed to secure a place of their own for so many crofters through the crofting grant scheme. I think that's been a success, and I think Mr MacDonald is well aware of just how successful it's been, with more than 1,000 grants since 2007. It doesn't sound a lot. It's quite a lot for many crofting communities. As far as the legislation goes, Mr MacDonald is correct. We had to suspend it because of Brexit and COVID, and we had intended to proceed, so I very much regret that we were not able to do that in this Parliament. I anticipate that we will do it in the next Parliament. I certainly would want to do so. The Law Society of Scotland have undertaken a good piece of work, and I can't go into it in detail, but I just draw members' attention to it. There's a full report and summary available on the Law Society of Scotland website, and I'm grateful to them for that. And there has been a lot of work behind the scenes, which is a legacy which the next government can use and gain from, including the work of the cross-party group on crofting, and others, pro bono advice from many crofting lawyers and experts. So we will return to this issue, but I think the development plan and the crofting grants and support, the CAGS grants, are absolutely invaluable to crofting. And finally, I'm determined to do even more. As mentioned, 100 crofters gained from forestry. Not all crofting land is suitable for forestry, of course, but I think we can do a lot more, and therefore I'm working on that as we speak.
Okay, that's good to hear. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angus. Before we move on, I've just got a couple of questions, if I may, on crofting, Cabinet Secretary. The SUMP report was a committee that produced the SUMP report was set up in 2013. So we are 8 years down the track from when they came up with all their conclusions. I think we hoped as a committee at the beginning of this session we'd see some movement on this. How much longer do you think it will be before those recommendations in the SUMP report are actually dealt with, Cabinet?
Well, this is just my personal view, because I think it is for the next Parliament, but I would very much hope that it could be the SUMP issues, which we were committed to tackling and remain committed to tackling, can be tackled in the first or second year of the next session of Parliament. That would be my hope. I think, frankly, it would be up to the next Parliament. It's not for me to say what the next Parliament must do, but these are my ideas. When I say first or second year, I think we all understand on this committee that have considered this, how difficult it is to get a large consensus on reform in crofting areas, and that previous experience in Parliament, and I've had 22 years of experience, shows that just when you think that consensus exists, somehow it slips through your fingers as if you're trying to hold a glass of mercury. And that is no criticism of anybody. It's simply an observation. And therefore, I think festina lente is a good watchword to bear in mind in crofting reform. That has proven to be the case so far. But it's not for lack of goodwill on the part of any party, I think. The goodwill is there. And I would have stated seriously, I'm very disappointed we couldn't do it. But the legislative workload and burden this Parliament has had because of Brexit and COVID speaks for itself. It's there. It is a matter of fact, I think. I don't think anyone could gainsay that that plus the way Parliament has chosen to debate things ad infinitum at stage 3, which they've already debated at stage 2. My personal view is that if we stop doing that, we'll have much more time to do more.
Sounds like you're making a pitch for the presiding officer's role. But anyway, Cabinet Secretary, if I could just say on that, that my problem with the crofting law is that having worked it within the crofting management side of it, is to understand crofting law, you have to have about 4 books open on the table at any one stage to understand what actual bit of crofting law is relevant. And my concern and my abiding wish is that crofting survives into the future and has a really prominent part to play. But I don't believe it can do that with 4 law books open on the table to understand even the basics of it. Would you agree with me on that?
I think it's an extremely fair point. I am, and I have previously been the minister leading consolidation acts in bankruptcy, for example, where exactly the same criticism was levelled. There was a plethora of legislation dating back to the 1985 Act, as I recall. So yes, I do think that it would be helpful if the next Parliament is not only able to deal with the SUMP and legislate for that, but then thereafter, if there is an opportunity, have a consolidation bill, which would then remove the issue that you, convener, quite rightly point out.
Which hopefully, just as in passing, I would say, would identify the really positive role that crofting plays in the countryside, not only to do with farming, food production, and the environment, but also keeping people in the countryside and keeping communities going. I make that as a comment, which I would seek your agreement on.
Well, up to a point, but I think, law is words on a page. It's about the programmes, it's about the action we take as well, and perhaps primarily, I think. But law plays a part, and the law is a bit complicated at the moment. So the SUMP is the priority. I would like to stress that. If there's the opportunity in the next Parliament for Consolidation Act, then that would be fine. I should stress the Law Commission has an important role to play here, and it's not for me to preempt that role in relation to consolidation. So I'd want to hear from our legal advisors at some point.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I'm now going to move to Emma Harper. And Emma, I would say, if I may, to choose your questions carefully, for which there will be 2. So, Emma.
Thanks, convener. It's unfortunate that the best questions are the last questions in timing, but the Women in Agriculture Task Force gave us evidence on December the 9th, and that was a year on from their final report, and they highlighted a number of issues that might need some support. So there's diversification, environmental schemes, organic farming, training and skills, and support for new entrants. So, Cabinet Secretary, what opportunities are you considering that would help support helping women in agriculture get further on and further success?
Well, thanks for the question. And of course, women are achieving great things in agriculture, and no one more so than Joyce Campbell, who co-chaired the Women in Agriculture group with myself, and who've produced a report that I think is really of real practical value. So opportunities, well, we're piloting a women's rural business creation programme with a third of places allocated to women in agriculture who wish to diversify their businesses. If successful, this programme could be widened, empowering more women in the rural economy. We've invested £100,000 in our Women in Agriculture Practical Training Fund. Lantra administer that with their experience of training and skills in the rural economy. And this is to support all women living or working in agriculture who want to develop new skills, including new entrants or young women in family businesses that might want to learn more about how to further upskill themselves, because increasingly farming involves so many different activities that there are particular skills to be learned. So we're also working with Lantra Scotland through the Scottish Government CivTech Challenge process to sponsor the development of a skills sharing app by the company Skills Cedar. So those are 3 practical things that we're doing, but I hope that the next Parliament can continue the implementation of the Women in Agricultural Task Force report, which points the way, I think, to further progress in enabling women to achieve even more in rural Scotland.
Thank you. I can ask just one final question, convener, if that's okay. I know that the Be Your Best Self training programme has been delayed due to COVID, but my final question would be about working across government and local authorities to support early learning and ensure childcare provisions in rural areas help support the advancement of women in agriculture. Could the Cabinet Secretary update us a wee bit on that, please?
Well, the Be Your Best Self training pilot has been delivered to 3 groups of women in Scottish agriculture, and the online version of the workshop has been successful, and it allows us to roll out this more widely and make it more accessible. And a new contract for the mainstream programme will be going out to tender in the near future, and encourage all women who wish to take part in the training to register their interest through the RPNS website. In addition, the equality is and should obviously be normalised within rural and agricultural policy, and I obviously want to see that work continue as well.
Emma, you did indicate there might be one further small question regarding childcare that you might like to ask. Do you want to push that question very briefly, if I could ask you?
Sure, convener, and I'm happy to take a written response if that would help in the interest of time. It was just to look at the issue around childcare provision in rural areas. That was highlighted as a challenge as well, and it's not necessarily directly the Cabinet Secretary's brief because it covers other portfolios, but is there work that's continued to be looked at as far as childcare provision for women in agriculture?
Yes, research. Sorry, convener.
No, I was going to say, if you want to do a written response to that, I'm happy, but if you want to give a brief answer, that's fine.
I think briefly I can say research has been carried out with childcare providers. A report has been finalised that examines some innovative and flexible models of childcare, including outdoor provision and integrated services, sort of practically orientated.
Not fair, this is frozen.
I think that's this time it's Fergus that the Cabinet Secretary that's frozen. Is that right, Emma? Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
So the Cabinet Secretary's frozen. So I'll make no comments about broadband in the Highlands because I got ticked off because it works very well, I'm told by Angus, in the Islands. So on the basis that we're not going to get the Cabinet Secretary back, and on the basis that he doesn't have to answer questions anymore on broadband, I'd like to thank the witnesses for taking part in this evidence session, and I'm going to suspend the meeting till 10:45 to allow a changeover of witnesses. And Mr. Burgess, if you could pass on my thanks to the Cabinet Secretary, because you're probably more likely to speak to him before I do. So on that basis, I suspend the meeting for 5 minutes. Thank you. And welcome back to the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee meeting. We're going to move on to agenda item 2, which is the European Withdrawal Act 2018. And this is the sift of 2 Brexit-related SSIs as detailed on the agenda. Members are invited to consider whether they are content with the Scottish Government's proposal that the affirmative procedure is appropriate to the following instruments, and that is the Sea Fishing EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulation 2021. Is the committee agreed that it is content for the parliamentary procedure allocated to this instrument by the Scottish Government? I'm not seeing anyone disagreeing. Members are also invited to note that the mandatory affirmative status for the following instrument, the Trade in Animals Related Products EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulation 2021 is applied. This is noted, therefore, by the committee. We'll then move on to agenda item 2, which is subordinate legislation. This is consideration of subordinate legislation, 2 affirmative and 1 made affirmative instruments as detailed on the agenda. The committee will take evidence on the Sea Fishing EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2021, the Trade in Animals Related Products EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2021, and the Rural Support Controls Coronavirus Scotland Regulations 2021. The motion seeking the approval of these instruments will be considered in items 4, 5 and 6. Could I welcome from the Scottish Government Ben McPherson, the Minister for Rural Affairs and the Natural Environment, Lynn Stewart, the Head of Direct Payments, Andrew Crawley, a lawyer for the Scottish Government, Jesus Gallego, the Head of Agricultural and Rural Economy EU Exit Unit and Deputy Chief Veterinary Officer Scotland, Keith White, a lawyer from the Scottish Government, Owen Griffiths from Marine Scotland Legislation Manager, and Lucy McMichael, a lawyer from the Scottish Government. I think if Lucy's turned up, if not, may still be having problems with her internet. Minister, would you like to make a brief opening statement just on the Sea Fishing's EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations? And I'll then ask for members to ask any questions on that regulation. Minister.
Good morning, Convener, and I would like to thank the committee for taking the time to consider these important regulations. The Sea Fishing EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2021 make a technical amendment to the Sea Fishing Illegal, Unreported and Unregulated Fishing Scotland Order 2013 to reflect amendments made by a UK Government SI, namely the Common Fisheries Policy Amendment etc. Regulations 2021, to retained Council Regulation EC number 1005/2008, establishing a community system to prevent, deter and eliminate illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, known as the IUU regulation, thereby facilitating the access to the market within Great Britain of qualifying Northern Ireland goods. The amendment is necessary to clarify that it is an offence to import fishery products into Scotland without a validated catch certificate in circumstances where such a catch certificate is required by virtue of Article 12 of the IUU regulation. The requirement to present a valid catch certificate, subject to certain exceptions, is required when fishery products are imported into Great Britain. The amendment made by these regulations reflects that it is not an offence to import fishery products into Scotland without a validated catch certificate where those fishery products constitute qualifying Northern Ireland goods. The term qualifying Northern Ireland goods is defined in another UK Government SI, the definition of qualifying Northern Ireland goods, EU Exit Regulations 2020. Therefore, the amendment these regulations in front of us today make to the 2013 order facilitate unfettered market access to the GB market for certain fishery products. Returning to the interaction with the UKSI for a moment, I am bound to inform the committee that there has been some slippage on the UK government's timetables. The UK SI was to have been laid last week, but unfortunately this SI was held over. And DEFRA do not yet have a confirmed new laying slot or coming into force date. It is essential for our SSI that the UK legislation is enforced before the 1st of June, which is the coming into force date we have provided for. So we await further updates, but if the UK SI coming into force date is going to slip beyond the 1st of June, we will be forced to withdraw this instrument before us today. Obviously this is regrettable, and I'm sorry of not being able to provide the committee with more certainty, but that is out of the Scottish Government's hands. But we will update the committee as soon as we have more information from the UK Government. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Minister. I'm looking to see if there's any members of the committee who want to ask any questions on that. I'm not seeing anyone. So therefore, Minister, could I ask you please to make a brief opening statement in relation to the trade in animals related products, EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2021. And then I believe there are some questions from members on this. So, Minister.
Thank you again, Convener, and members of the committee. Thank you for taking the time again to consider the Trade in Animals and Related Products EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2021. The purpose of this instrument is to create a power which will allow Scottish ministers by regulation to impose special import conditions in respect of imports from third countries of products of animal origin intended for human consumption, having regard to the animal health situation of the third country or countries concerned. It mirrors the function of the Commission under Article 8.4 of Council Directive 2002/99/EC and may amend, modify or revoke any retained direct minor EU legislation made under that power. Importantly, this legislation today is solely to create the power, and further legislation will be required if we want to make use of this. Retained EU law does not otherwise contain this power to make legislation of this type, which the Commission had under the EU directive. On this basis, it is therefore considered appropriate that ministers should have this power to deal with situations where ministers may want to impose special import conditions on products of animal origin from third countries because of the animal health situation there. Special import conditions could be introduced for the purpose of protecting public health or animal health and on the basis of scientific evidence and risk. This approach has also been adopted by other administrations in order to ensure a consistent GB-wide approach. I trust that this provides members with sufficient assurance for why the changes are being made and why the Scottish Government considers them necessary. However, my officials and I are very happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think there are some questions. Emma Harper, did you want to ask a question on this? Emma.
Yes, Convener. Thank you. I'm just waiting on my camera coming on, so thank you, Convener. I do have a couple of questions because I've raised issues of food safety and especially importation from countries outside the EU previously. Concerns with hormones and antibiotic use, for instance, is one of my concerns. So, Minister, is the purpose of an import condition only to provide an appropriate level of assurance that standards have been met, rather than setting the standards themselves?
Convener, yep, shall I come in?
Yeah, sorry, Minister, if it's direct, rather than me add another layer of checks and balances which stops the flow, happy for you to come straight in if the question's asked to you. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. And thank you to Emma Harper for that question. Alluding to my opening statement, but adding in response that it could be either or both in response to Emma Harper. So we wish to provide assurance that assurance that standards have been met is in itself a possible import condition, as may requiring that a particular step or measure has been taken in relation to the food product. So, in summary, it could be either or both.
Emma.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Because it is interesting that we have special import conditions which might be distinct or from normal or general import conditions, and so in the purpose of the EU context, is that to add additional import requirements on the basis of risk, so that we can have satisfactory assurance that standards have been met, Minister?
Yes, the special import conditions in issue here are ones which have been made under Article 8.4 of Council Directive 2002/99/EC, which I referred to in the opening statement, and which form part of retained EU law. So the purpose of this instrument before us today is to provide a way by which those conditions may be amended, modified or revoked by subordinate legislation, given that the power to make them came from a directive which does not form part of retained EU law. So the power cannot be used to amend, modify or revoke any other import conditions which form part of retained EU law. They will be based on an assessment of the specific risk posed by, for example, products from a certain country. They may apply in addition to or instead of the general requirements of the same products from other countries, and are better described as more appropriate to the specific circumstances rather than stricter. Where the risk assessment demonstrates a reduced risk, the special import condition may revoke an unnecessary import condition, for example, after an outbreak has been controlled. So I hope that gives Emma Harper the reassurance that she asked for.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Minister.
Okay. Peter Chapman, I think you had some questions there, Peter.
Yes, Convener. Minister, in the EU, this power is in the context of providing additional assurance that imported products meet the EU standards. But could this new power be used to allow the import of products which do not meet the current GB standards, as opposed to as an additional safeguard to ensure that products do meet them?
The intention is for making sure we maintain our high standards here in GB as a whole and in Scotland. Jesus, could you come and add a bit more detail on that point to Mr. Chapman?
Well, I mean, the concern is that, as I understand it, that we may be following EU standards rather than GB standards. Would this be an instrument that would allow that? You know, in many cases, GB standards are actually higher than EU standards, contrary to what many people would have you believe.
The power cannot be used to lower the standards that are applicable as a matter of law within Great Britain to products of animal origin for human consumption generally. It can only be used to amend, modify or revoke import conditions made under the powers of Article 8.4 of Directive 2002/99/EC.
Well, fair enough. I think you possibly answered my final question, which I will just pose it, and you can agree or disagree. I mean, can an assurance be given that the new power will not be used to relax a general import condition, only to relax an existing special import condition?
Yes, the power may not be used to amend, modify or revoke anything other than what is in retained EU law already a special import condition made under Article 84 of Council Directive 2002/99 EC. So yes.
Okay, convener, I guess that's me.
Okay. Stuart, did you have some questions on this, Stuart?
I've got one now as a result of what we've heard, and it's quite a technical one that relates to frozen meat decision 272, which is a decision that was made under Article 8(4) that we've been talking about. But the decision itself doesn't actually refer to that. So does the Scottish Government consider that this is covered under 8(4)? And if so, why is that so, since the Commission decision doesn't appear to make that reference? I realise that's quite a technical question. It may be for an official rather than the Minister to answer.
Minister. I didn't quite hear the beginning of Mr. Stuart Stevenson's question there, but I hope this gives the answer he was looking for. The Commission decision 2005/72 was originally made under Council Directive 9465 EC, and when Council Directive 9465 EC was repealed by Directive 2004/41 EC, provision was made for Commission decision 2005/72 to continue in force as made under Article 8(4) of the Council Directive 2002/99 EC. And I don't know if, Jesus, you want to add anything on that?
Minister, I think, to be honest, you've answered the question and we don't need to pursue it further, if I may.
Thank you, Stuart. Jamie Halcroft-Johnson, did you have some questions, sir?
I did, convener. I think I'm just waiting to appear. Good morning, Minister. A number of fairly quick questions. The first one is why the list of examples of special import conditions provided by the Scottish Government is different from that provided on the European Commission's website.
So the list provided is of special import conditions that have been made under Article 8(4) of Council Directive 2002/99 EC and which form part of retained EU law. It does not include any measures which are in place as a matter of retained EU law, but which have been made under different powers and which cannot be amended, modified or revoked by this power.
Okay, thank you for that, Minister. And also, does the UK Internal Market Act 2020 have a bearing on whether special import conditions imposed by the Scottish Government would be effective in relation to products of animal origin that are put on the market in Scotland after having been imported first into another part of the UK?
Well, the UK Internal Market Act, as you know, the Scottish Government's position is that we maintain that this is fundamentally inconsistent with devolution and centralising control in UK Government and the UK Parliament, cutting across devolved powers by imposing new domestic constraints. It means losing the benefits of variations in approach to reflect consumer preferences and health and environmental considerations in Scotland and the advantages of high quality regulation of meat and fish products. It allows the lowering of standards because under the market principles, Scotland will be compelled to accept standards set by other administrations in the UK, regardless of the views and decisions of the Scottish Government and the Parliament. So even where the Scottish Parliament and Scottish ministers wish to maintain alignment with EU standards, the Act risks undermining those devolved policy choices and would force us, in some cases, to accept lower standards set elsewhere if those lower standards were set elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. So it could see...
Jamie.
Sorry, I didn't catch the last minute of that, Minister.
So it has the potential to have an effect.
Okay, thank you for that. Can I just, so there could be, obviously, as has been mentioned, divergence. It could be that we are in line with EU standards, but not necessarily wider UK standards. So can I ask what consultation or discussions there have been with the UK government and also with stakeholders in Scotland that might be impacted by any divergence from rest of UK standards?
Well, at the moment, given the ongoing challenge to both the UK government and the Scottish government of aligning our regulations following EU exit with the different considerations that EU exit creates, the reason, the rationale for the legislation before us today and the process that the UK government are also involved in is, of course, to set the legislation. Whether there is divergence or not will be something to consider in due course. Of course, we would hope and implore the UK government to uphold high standards, but the challenges will come if there are divergences as a result of trade agreements or different policy decisions in different parts of the UK.
Can I very quickly, Convener, just ask? I mean, if there is divergence, if these powers are used, will that require any consultation or engagement with stakeholders in Scotland that might be impacted?
In general terms, or in relation to this?
Well, in general, if the powers are used in the future, and obviously there will be different potential ways of using it, does that require you, or would you be committed to engaging or discussing with stakeholders?
Jesus, I'd be grateful if you could come in at this point from a process position.
Sorry, I didn't catch who you were calling in.
Apologies, Convener. Jesus Gallego, I'd be grateful if you could come in at this point.
Perfect, and I'm glad you brought him in because apparently I completely mispronounced your name, which shows a complete lack of the right way of doing it. And I'm not now going to try and correct myself, but to ask if you'll accept my apologies and if you'd like to come in now, please.
Of course, Convener, thank you, and thank you, Minister. Yes, I think bearing in mind that the power is confined to import conditions that are made following scientific advice and a risk assessment. So that involves a degree of consultation of either already available information and evidence or evidence that is gathered at the time when the changes potentially affect food safety, food standards. Scotland has a statutory obligation to consult anyway. When they are purely on animal health requirements, we would follow our normal parliamentary handling procedures for developing legislation, because this power does not make any immediate changes. It only gives us the power to introduce legislation later. But first, the scope is very limited to those pieces of legislation made under Article 8.4. And second, it is subject to scientific and advice and risk assessment.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful, and thank you, Minister, as well.
I'm not seeing any other members that want to ask any questions. So, Minister, could I ask you to make a brief opening statement on the Rural Support Controls Coronavirus Scotland Regulations 2021? Minister.
Thank you again, Convener, and thanks to the committee for making time to consider these regulations today too. These regulations were laid using powers conferred by the horizontal regulation that has been incorporated into domestic law. These regulations will provide a necessary temporary derogation from the requirement for the verification of all eligibility conditions be completed before scheme payments commence. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, on-the-spot checks have been suspended. We cannot be sure when those checks will be able to restart. The effect of the derogation is that payments to beneficiaries may be for the schemes covered by the derogation after the administrative checks have been finalised. This will enable us to make payments timorously before completing physical on-the-spot checks. Unless these regulations before us today are approved and brought into force by the 31st of March, we will not be able to make our 2020 claim year voluntary coupled support payments in April and May as scheduled. The suspension of on-the-spot checks is adding to a backlog of inspections, creating a delay in the remainder of the inspections programme. In order to prevent this delaying payments due later this year, the same derogation is applied for designated direct payment schemes and the less favoured areas support scheme. For these reasons, these regulations before us today are considered to be necessary and justifiable in response to an emergency caused by the ongoing pandemic. To conclude, my focus now is to continue to support our farmers and crofters to ensure payments can continue to be made to them on time for claim years 2020 and 2021, while also adhering to the coronavirus restrictions for the safety of our officials, farmers and crofters. I'm happy to take any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Minister. I'm not seeing any questions from committee members, so I suggest we move now on to the formal consideration of the motions relating to each of these instruments. So, turning to agenda item 4, this is the consideration of motion S5M 24228, that the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee recommends that the Sea Fishing EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2021 be approved. Can I ask you, Minister, to move the motion? And also ask if you want to make, do you wish to make any further comments, or are you happy with the comments you made?
No further comment, Convener, and formally moved. Thank you.
Thank you. Ask if there's any comments from any members of the committee. There aren't any comments. So the question is that motion S5M 24228 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Just put an N in the chat box if not. I'm not seeing any N's, therefore that's agreed. Therefore we'll move on to agenda item 5, and this is a consideration of motion S5M 24226, that the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee recommends that the Trade in Animals and Related Products EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2021 be approved. Can I ask you, Minister, to move the motion and speak to it if you have any comments you wish to make? Minister.
Thank you to members for their questions, and formally moved.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments from members? There aren't any. So the question, therefore, is that motion S5M 24226 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Therefore, I move on to agenda item 6, which is the consideration of motion S5M 24227, that the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee recommends that the Rural Support Controls Coronavirus Scotland Regulations 2021 be approved. Minister, can I ask you to move the motion and speak to it if you wish to, Minister?
Formally moved, Convener.
Thank you. Are there any comments that members may wish to make? Don't appear to be. So the question is that motion S5M 24227 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. That concludes our consideration of these SSIs. Can I thank you, Minister, and your officials for your time today in attending to the committee to talk to these instruments. The time now is 11:17, and I'm going to suspend the meeting till 11:25 to allow the next panel of witnesses to be taken on board. So I suspend the meeting. Welcome back to the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee meeting. We are now moving on to agenda item 7, which is on the construction and procurement of ferry vessels in Scotland. I welcome to the committee Paul Wheelhouse, the Minister for Energy, Connectivity and the Islands, Chris Wilcott, the Head of the Ferries Unit for Scottish Government, and Tim Hare, the Turnaround Director for Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow Limited. Minister, would you like to make a brief opening statement, please? Minister.
Thank you, Convener, and I will keep this brief. Good morning to you and to colleagues. I welcome the opportunity to address the committee today in my capacity as Minister for Energy, Connectivity and the Islands, and I would again like to take the opportunity to thank the committee members for their detailed consideration of what the committee's report clearly acknowledges are broad-ranging, complex and important issues. As a Minister with responsibility for Scotland's supported ferry services, I'd like to reiterate our commitment to our lifeline ferries across both networks and the communities that they serve. And I would like to begin by recognising the significant effort that goes into the delivery of ferry services in Scotland, particularly during recent months, with a focus on the response to the COVID pandemic, where staff have had to balance the need to both connect and protect our island communities. So I would like to, if it's with your permission, Convener, just to thank all those staff who are involved across both ferry networks and indeed other networks which we do not operate directly for keeping our Scotland's communities connected through our ferry networks and keeping them operating during this very tough period. However, I recognise the need for continuous improvement, and I've now said several times that I share the committee's ambition to identify and address future challenges and opportunities in the procurement and operation of vessels for the Scottish Ferries networks, plural, sorry. The committee has specifically asked for an update on the timetable for completion of vessels at Ferguson's. As noted in my response, we're still working to the timetable and costs as set out in the Turnaround Director's report of August 2020. However, we will be undertaking a further review of this in the coming months, including considering the further impact that COVID pandemic has had on these timescales. So the committee and indeed communities are keen to have an update on cost and programme for the vessels, but I'm sure the committee will understand the reason for timing of this more detailed work. However, to ensure we give as helpful information to the committee today as possible, I felt it was important to have Mr Tim Hare in attendance today to answer any more detailed questions you may have on this, and I thank the committee for accepting that offer to have Mr Hare with us today. So thank you, Convener. I'm happy to address the committee's questions, as are my colleagues, as best we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. The first questions are from Mike Rumbles. Mike.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you, Minister, for coming along to the committee today, because this is the first opportunity we've had to question you out with the debate in the Chamber on our report that we looked into 801 and 802. But my specific question I'd like to start with, CMAL has just launched a 10-year small vessel replacement programme. Now, considering that the committee unanimously, and I mean unanimously, took the view in our inquiry report that CMAL was, quote, not fit for purpose, unquote, why should anyone have any confidence in this CMAL plan?
Thank you to Mr Rumbles for the question. I mean, clearly the small vessel replacement programme is a critical programme for the communities that it serves. There are obviously 8 Loch-class vessels that we are looking to replace as part of this programme. This actually dates back to the 2018 Ferries Plan as a commitment we'd made previously to replace these vessels. So it's very important we get that work underway now. I recognise, although we don't, as we debated in the Chamber, so I'm not going to revisit that, we don't necessarily agree with every finding in the report, but we do recognise there are lessons to be learned from the delivery of 801 and 802, and I acknowledge the concerns Mr Rumbles and others have expressed about how that has unfolded in time. And we clearly want to learn those lessons. We are in the process of commissioning a tripartite review, which I think was debated in the Chamber recently, and we've expressed our keenness to make sure that exercise looks at such matters for the future. But rather than delay the procurement of the small vessel replacement programme or getting that underway, we feel it's important to get that work started, and I hope Mr Rumbles would understand why for the communities that are served by those vessels. But clearly we are learning lessons also from an 801 and 802, just to reassure him, and additional steps which I can go into if it would be helpful. Additional steps we're taking to ensure that procurement of vessels does learn important lessons from the committee's report, and indeed our own exploration of what did not work well during that process.
If I may, I mean, I can understand the point of view that you've just expressed, that you don't want to revisit the debate, and I don't want to revisit the debate either. But there are issues that the committee addressed and identified in our report, and Minister, you obviously in the debate didn't agree with it. But I come back to the question: if there are no party political points I'm trying to make here. I'm simply trying to get this right for the future. And our concern on the committee, every member was concerned that the mistakes that were made by CMAL, amongst other organisations, but particularly by CMAL, on 801 and 802, might be repeated in the procurement programme. And you said lessons will be learned, but I mean, that's, forgive me for saying so, that's a generalisation. It doesn't address the specific issues we had. And I'm not identifying any individuals with CML, I'm talking about the organisational process here. That we seem to be going, and I hope we aren't, but aren't we just going ahead as normal? That's my worry.
I recognise that concern, Mr Rummels, and for what it's worth, I recognise you're not making party political points. I appreciate you as other committee members are doing your job as diligent members to try and make sure we do implement any lessons that have been learned and make sure we don't repeat the mistakes that have been made in the past. To try and reassure you, I mean, certainly CMAL is already committed to improving its own processes in this area, including, irrespective of what happens in the tripartite review, I should stress, including additional financial diligence and the use of additional naval architectural specialists to consider the abilities and track record of the yard or yards that are contracted to undertake any contracts that come through the small vessel replacement programme. And the overall procurement strategy for the vessels will be developed as part of the programme as well, including a focus on how to ensure these are delivered as efficiently as possible and to address the concerns that the committee has raised through the report. So a first independent assurance review of the small vessel replacement programme has been undertaken, and further formal gateway reviews will be undertaken at key milestones during the course of the programme. And I hope that gives some reassurance to Mr Rumbles. I'm happy to try and address anything that goes beyond that as best I can, but just extra checks and balances are being put in place, and we are, as we would acknowledge some of the concerns around the capability of Ferguson Marine as previously constituted under its previous management to deliver the contracts 801 and 802, and trying to learn from that in terms of additional diligence around the technical capability and track record of contractors before we commission work with yards. And we can talk more about that if that would be helpful.
Convener, I'm conscious of time, and I know the members may wish to come in, so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Okay. Peter Chapman, I think you had some questions on that. Peter.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning to Cabinet Minister. And I have some further questions on that. I mean, you've mentioned the review, and in the debate on the 2nd of February, you dismissed the unanimous view of the committee of the need to change the organisational structure, and instead you relied on an upcoming review to provide recommendations. So can I ask, can you tell the committee what the remit of this review is? What will the review cover, and what will not be allowed? What will it not be allowed to look at?
I'm not aware of anything that we specified that cannot be looked at, but I can obviously bring in Chris Wilcock on that in case there's anything I'm unaware of. I would maybe just I appreciate there was quite a heated debate in the chamber on the committee report, but I would want to just reflect the point that Mr Chapman's made, that if there's any kind of sense that we have not reflected on the issues that have been caused and are implementing many of the recommendations, as I think I acknowledged in the chamber, we are. There are some specific recommendations we had, obviously a difference of view on, as can happen with any report that is produced by anybody, not least Parliament. But I hope that doesn't take away from the fact we have taken very serious recognition of some of the points, key points that have been raised by the committee, and obviously we are trying to address those. In terms of the tripartite review, We are in a quite advanced stage in terms of commissioning the review. The consultants for the work, we're currently going through the final stages of appointment of those consultants. We're through the standstill period now. I believe there's a final meeting, or initial meeting I should say, on the appointment process later this week. And once that is over with, I would imagine award letters will be signed and we can talk more openly about who the contractors are. We anticipate the work will complete later this year, so we're expecting about a 6 to 9 month period for the work, and then we would act on any immediate issues. After considering any recommendations, we'd of course obviously act on any immediate issues that could be addressed at an interim stage in production of the review, so it wouldn't be waiting for the full 9 months. The consultants team will include experts in terms of having a focus on governance and transport in the public and private sector from around the world. Transport Scotland will work with consultants to develop any wider engagement required, including look at whether further expertise with experience in operating external models is appropriate. A significant focus of the work that the consultants will be undertaking will be reviewing the technical and legal structures around the existing arrangements and whether or not the original reasoning for setting out the bodies in 2006 still apply, and whether it remains fit for purpose and identifying any new options that may be available now. I've certainly, although I know it's a very technical study that's going to be done, we've also asked Transport Scotland to consider the role that bodies such as the Calmac Community Board could play in engaging with the work as well. Maybe if I can, Convener, just to address the points being made by Mr Chapman, if maybe invite colleague Chris Wilcock just to say if there's anything that's out of scope in the study that I'm not aware of.
Chris.
Well, good afternoon. No, I would confirm what you said there, Minister. The scope is pretty wide-ranging. We will start from that technical standpoint to see whether or not the structures as they are and the reasons why we put them in place in the first place still stands, to see whether or not that defines any parameters for us, and then look to see whether they're fit for purpose or there are ways we could be making amendments to those in the kind of medium to longer term. We'll be meeting with the consultants on Friday. We'll be able to set out in more detail what we might see also at an interim stage to see whether there's kind of early lessons to be picked up on there. But to pick up Mr Chapman's point, the scope is wide-ranging. We've certainly not said, from my recollection, and there's certainly not anything we've said to the consultants is off limits, and it will include a review of the role of all three organisations involved in the tripartite and a very detailed look at how we improve those processes going forward.
Peter.
Well, just for complete clarity and just to be sure, you will be aware that we were very, as a committee, very critical of CMAL and very critical of the complex tripartite way of making decisions. So, just for clarity, will it be within the remit of the review to recommend that CMAL be scrapped? Is that within? Can the review go as far as if that's what it finds, that CMAL should be scrapped?
I think the way we would put it, I mean, I understand why, Mr Chapman, you're asking that question. I'd rather than respond in a direct way, I don't want to kind of prejudice anything that the consultants will look at. They've obviously got the initial meeting coming up this week with Transport Scotland to set the ball rolling. They may well come forward with recommendations about future structure of the current organisation. Obviously, a different structure going forward based on their expertise and experience. I don't want to kind of channel it down a particular direction. We're obviously we'll take those recommendations and consider them. So I don't want to kind of prejudge or preempt anything that may go in the study. But certainly, CMAL do recognise the concerns that the member has, the line convener, and a number of steps which have been taken by CMAL already around due diligence for all contracts of value more than £500,000. Do recognise it, and that includes working with credit reference agents, credit rating agencies to ensure a comprehensive assessment of a business's financial health before we contract with them, and taking new steps around pre-qualification and invitation to tenders as well. So CMAL will advise any future bidders that should there be an unwarranted negotiation or withdrawal of any material element of a bid, such as a bank guarantee, which is obviously critical in terms of financial stability of a bidder, then the bidder will simply be removed from the procurement process. So these are new steps that are putting in place. They're also engaging the services of a shipbroker to enhance understanding regarding shipyards, including previous track records, as I mentioned earlier, skills and competencies in terms of first-class products. Additional levels of assurance for full tender assessment will also be introduced by engaging the naval architect companies that I mentioned earlier as well. So I think, irrespective of what the study actually finds, we're already trying to address many of the concerns that were raised by the committee. I just want to say that to reassure Mr Chapman and others that we have been listening, and as have CMAL, and trying to put in place steps to give additional assurance. If the study then comes forward with recommendations about restructuring, then obviously we'll look closely at the recommendations, but I don't want to, Mr Chapman understands why, I don't want to kind of give us any kind of steer at this point. I want it to be genuinely independent and objective, and then to come forward what the consultants recommend is the best structure to achieve our objectives going forward.
Okay, thank you, Convener. I'll leave it there.
I want to bring in briefly Colin, if I may, before I go to John Finney. Colin.
Thank you very much, Convener. Minister, the Transport Scotland and the Scottish Government are part of the tripartite agreement. You've talked quite heavily about the role Transport Scotland will have in this review. Surely we need a completely independent review of the arrangement, not something that Transport Scotland seem to be leading almost on.
I can certainly understand where Mr Smith is coming from, and appreciate the government has to contract with external advisors here. It will be a genuinely independent report, that will be produced for ministers. Ministers obviously can't predetermine the outcome of that review, or indeed in advance of an election predetermine which ministers will be making that decision. But I'm confident that the study will be done with a high degree of professionalism by the consultants, independently of government in terms of either Transport Scotland or ministers. That's why I'm being very studious not to give any kind of steer whatsoever, for the reasons I'm trying to make sure this is an independent exercise that comes forward with recommendation based on what, in their professional judgment, the consultants think is the optimal structure to address our ongoing needs for ferry procurement and operating our ferry network. So I do recognise why Mr Smith would ask it. It's a legitimate question. All I can say is I'll do everything I can, and I'm sure the government will do everything it can to make sure this exercise is objective, independent, and does the job that we need it to do, to give us a clear guidance as to the best structure going forward to address the needs of Scotland's ferry networks.
I'm going to come to John Finney now. John, you've got some questions, I believe, John.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister, and your colleagues. Minister, I would like to ask a bit further, please, on the small vessel replacement programme. Can you explain why CMAL has launched the small vessel replacement programme before the publication of the Highlands Connectivity Plan or the next vessels replacement and deployment plan? Does this not potentially limit the scope of the new plans, preempt the results of public engagement, and indeed undermine efforts around issues such as vessel standardisation?
Well, I think it's a fair question for Mr Finney, and I've partly started to address this earlier on inadvertently in a different question, just in respect that the small vessel replacement programme is something which was referenced back in 2018 in the current ferries plan, when we set out an indicative vessel replacement programme which included replacing a number of small vessels during or soon after the life of the plan. And all those identified vessels remain in the fleet as of today. So the objective has been identified within the latest draft VRDP report, which we have begun starting to share with stakeholders, and the small vessel replacement programme will seek to address this specifically. So, as I say, I'll check with Mr Wilcott, but I believe there's 8 Loch class vessels that are required to be replaced over a period of up to 10 years. And this will help build a pipeline of investment, and obviously following on from or building on the current Tripart vessels project for the Clyde and Hebrides network as well. So they're largely, the vessels we have at the moment are largely interoperable, just to address the standardisation point, but we do intend to potentially enhance that interoperability through the reflecting a more standardised design a more or higher level of standardisation in the new programme. And it's obviously still at a very early stage of development, the small vessel replacement programme. So I want to make that point, as it's still some time off before it goes off to tender. The process will certainly include engagement with the key stakeholders and the communities that are affected by these vessels in developing this further, learning from the process we've now started to deploy in the procurement of the Isla vessel. And just taking the last point again, just around standardisation, we don't think it undermines the efforts around vessel standardisation. We're looking at procuring a series of vessels where similar specification and equipment can be maximised. So hopefully it will help as an early kind of win in an approach, if you like, to standardisation, where perhaps there's less of an issue around standardisation of the harbours or facilities that the vessels need to use. Might give us an early opportunity to explore the benefits of standardisation in terms of crew training, standard parts, and obviously potentially standardisation or improvements in fuel efficiency and other areas as well that we can then take forward in terms of design of other vessels. I hope I've addressed Mr. Finney's question, questions, but if I haven't, please do come back to me and I'll try and.
Yeah, thank you, Minister. And I wouldn't want to give the impression, as a representative, as the convener is of the Highlands and Islands, that we're not delighted to hear about new vessels. What about the notion that this is a very timely distraction? We should have a rolling programme of replacement anyway, a timely distraction from for CMAL. Could you comment on that, please?
All I can say is, from my point of view, Mr. Finney, it's not been in any way motivated by that, and I don't believe it's been motivated by either CMAL or Transport Scotland. We've obviously, smaller vessels do take less time to build and procure. There's obviously potentially early wins that we can get some improvements, address things like fuel efficiency. We're obviously looking at opportunities across the fleet for decarbonisation, and smaller vessels on shorter routes are easier to decarbonise than bigger vessels doing more kind of ocean going, if you like, work that requires more advanced propulsion sort of options. So I think there's a number of reasons why the small vessel replacement programme had been identified earlier on in the ferries plan back in 2018, but that they're attractive now, and it may provide an opportunity to build an early pipeline of projects that can help support the supply chain as well. So there are a number of reasons for this. And I don't think genuinely, if I thought it was an argument, it was a distraction, as Mr. Finney has described it, I would acknowledge that point. It's not been part of my motivation. We're obviously keen to get the Isla vessel procured as well as another early win, and we have committed in the infrastructure investment plan £580 million. Give more detail of that today, if that would be helpful, about what that is intended to do. And the small vessel replacement programme is part of that £580 million that we have announced.
Minister, sorry, just before I come back to you, John, Minister, could I just ask you, we are quite a long way into this session and we're still very short on questions being answered, i.e. we haven't got through very well. Could you speed up your answers, please? John, sorry, back to you.
Yeah, apologies.
John.
Thank you, Convener. I'll make this brief, Convener. Minister, it's about changes in state aid rules as a result of leaving the EU. Will that influence the Scottish Government's approach to vessel procurement? Will, for instance, you intend to competitively tender for such contracts? I hope not. My preferred option would be the direct award of small vessel contracts. Can you comment on that, please?
Well, certainly I recognise, and this is a point I know, Mr. Finney, you've made of long standing, that you're passionate about trying to support the supply chain, and we are currently working to understand the various impacts of the new subsidy control rules, as they're known, post the transition period, which were introduced, and I stress this, without prior notice to Scottish Government, and on an interim basis on the 1st of January of this year. The UK Government Department with responsibility for this is BASE, the new rules, and they are currently holding a consultation exercise on how these new rules should be applied for the longer term, which is due to close at the end of this month. So again, we will be feeding into that, and officials were given, again, no prior notice of the detail or timing of that exercise, but we will feed into that and make sure that we are contributing fully to the consultation in advance of the end of this month, and obviously with Purda kicking in, we'll try and obviously beat that deadline if we can. Officials are obviously working very hard to try and gain clarity on these new rules and the various impacts and subsidies, including ferry service and clearly including on procurement opportunities. So we are in a position, a little bit of a hiatus. We don't know exactly what the rules are. We are, however, given the urgency of investment for the Isla vessel, we are intending to go ahead with an invitation to tender on the Isla project, as we can't afford, we believe, to delay that. It's worth stating, though, for the benefit, and maybe something that Mr. Hare wants to reflect on later in his contributions. Obviously, we know that Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow has got 2 major vessels to produce at this time, and therefore, there's not immediate capacity at the yard, but they may obviously still be able to tender for that exercise. Well, that's a matter that Mr. Hare and the management of Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow would have to consider at the time. But we are very mindful of the need to look at whether we can directly procure vessels, and that's something I just give a guarantee to Mr. Finney we will be looking at once we know the clarity on the subsidy control mechanisms.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Minister. Obviously, Convener, there's lots of questions I would like to ask, but I appreciate the restraints of time, so back to yourself. Thank you.
I'll try and bring you in at the end, John, if there's time. That's what we'll do. Stuart Stevenson, I think you've got some questions as well. Stuart.
Thank you, Convener, and they're directed essentially at the top here. And given that the Minister has just said there's not presently the capacity in the yard to take on significant new work, when might the yard be ready to go to the market and look for new work, in particular the government work, but work elsewhere? And are you confident that you have the people and the structures in place to be able to make successful bids and then carry them forward?
Tim, sorry, it goes straight to you rather than the Minister. I think that was directed at you.
Thank you. I think our working assumption is that we will have to win the next vessels on commercial terms, and I know that goes back to the previous subject, but it's probably worth saying. As it stands, the capacity in the yard's fully allocated to finishing off 805, which is the workboat for Involusa for aquaculture, which we will deliver in April, that's next month, and then fully allocated to 801 and 802. However, in the spring, summer of next year, we will have capacity available to start on the next vessel, and we are actively pursuing actively out in the market to try and find that next vessel. That will include potentially tendering for anything that CMAL has, where we think that their timescales fit our capacity and where we have the capability to do the kind of job that they would rightly expect.
Sure.
That was it will be spring, summer next year when significant capacity comes available at the yard. The 2 questions come from that last together. First of all, is that it in terms of work, assuming 805 is complete very shortly? And more to the point, how long in your experience does it actually take from the point where you get engaged in an invitation to tender or any process preceding that until you're able to start cutting metal in the yard? In other words, is it a year? In other words, are we within the time frame that means having space available early or mid next year positions you well for new contracts for the government or indeed elsewhere, be they on commercial or allocated terms?
I think I'm not sure.
Yeah. We can hear you.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Sorry, I'm less practiced at this than you. I think the speed of the process varies between potential customers, and obviously there are several months of detailed design work that needs to be completed before steel is cut. Our working assumption is that we are active in the market now. We will need to sign the contract for the next vessels towards the latter part of this year, and that will put us in a position to be cutting metal when manufacturing comes available in spring, summer next.
My final point that's just come out of what you've said, Tim, is are there any serious constraints in the design office? Because you really indicated the early part in any new work would lie. And if there are these ones you expect to be able to complete? And once I hear the answer to that, Convener, I'm finished.
As far as the design office is concerned, we have made excellent progress in establishing a design office at Ferguson. I remember when you visited us roughly a year ago, I commented that I was recruiting for a new head of engineering, and we appointed an excellent head of engineering in June. She has been very actively recruiting the necessary skills to be able to resource the design office and design controls at Ferguson. And we also have a contract that I know that I've mentioned in the past with International Contract Engineering, who are a specialist detailed design house who are providing us with large amounts of capacity to work through the 801, 802 design. So obviously, it's design is a challenge as we sort out 801, 802, but we're in a much better place than, frankly, I had expected to be in terms of our own resource today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Colin Smith, you've got some questions. Colin.
Thank you very much, Convener. Can I turn specifically to what you just mentioned, Mr. Hare, which was vessels 801 and 802. The committee received an update on the 21st of August last year on the construction of the two ferries. Can you tell us how much further the timescale has slipped since that update last year, and can any slippage be recovered, or will the estimated delivery dates now be later than the ones you set out in August 2020?
Thank you. As the Minister said in his opening remarks, we're still working to the timetable which was in that update. Though it's fair to say we hadn't, the update with that timetable was predicated on there not being a further intervention with COVID. We probably have two main areas of concern that we're dealing with. The first is that with a change in guidance on workplace canteens at the beginning of January, we had to suspend production in the yard for 4 weeks whilst we reconfigured our amenities. And we have, for some time now, been trying to recruit additional employees into the shipyard. And the combination of resource and that suspension is something that we're working through now as we figure out how to recover the schedule and what impact it will have. And I think probably the most critical thing on my agenda to be able to answer your question is that we announced last week that we will be putting a weekend shift on to start on the 19th of March, and we're currently very actively recruiting for up to 120 workers to resource that weekend shift, which will run Friday, Saturday, Sunday to fit in with our weekday shift. And our success in being able to resource that shift will influence the exact timetable of the project. So I think in summary, there are undoubtedly some challenges. We've lost time as a result of COVID suspension, and we also have a large holiday accrual that we need to work our way through. We're trying to mitigate that with very significant extra resource, and the success in hiring those skills will influence the exact timetable of the ferries. But right now, we are working to and doing everything we can to stay within the August timetable as published.
So just to be very clear, Mr. Hare, that when you gave that update in August, you said the delivery of 801 is now planned for the range April 2022 to June 2022, and you said the delivery of 802 is now planned for December 2022 to February 2023, and 802 launch will occur in early May 2022. So are you saying they are still on track to be met, and if not, what would stop that happening?
Those are still the dates that we're working to. The COVID suspension has undoubtedly put that timetable under pressure, but we're still driving hard to achieve it. The critical thing to being able to stick within that timetable or force us into a slippage is our ability to recruit the skilled workers that we need in order to resource the weekend shift that I referred to. We're very actively recruiting in order to resource that shift, and indeed we have been and continue to actively recruit for the weekday shift as well. Right now, I don't have an answer to how many people we will be able to recruit, and when we know that, we'll be able to give a clearer response.
I'll come to the recruitment issue in a second, but can I just ask, you see we're sticking very much to that timetable. There clearly has been slippage as a result of the pandemic and presumably other factors. Has that slippage added anything to the cost of completing these two vessels, or has there been additional cost to try to make sure you stick to that original timetable?
In August, I announced that the costs of the original lockdown we would treat as an exceptional item, and the production suspension that was also triggered by COVID will treat as an exceptional item as well. Putting that aside, we still intend to stay within the original budget that was approved in December 2019 of £110 million.
But contained within that was obviously a substantial contingency. How much of that contingency are you having to use in order to meet these additional challenges and delays?
Last question, Colin.
The COVID element, the COVID-related element, we're booking as an exceptional outside of the project, as we said in August. The contingency, there are some areas that we've had to use contingency, and there are one or two where we've been favourable. So right now we're still well within our contingency, although we have used a small amount of it. To give an estimate, I would say we have probably used about 1/10 of the contingency that. Wow.
Colin, I'm going to go to Richard Lyle, and then I'd like to ask a question myself. So, Richard, a question from you.
Yeah, for the sake of being quick, I'll ask a couple altogether. Mr. Hare, from our previous visit, you said you had a lot of items to fix. What's still outstanding? Is any of the ferry sections being constructed elsewhere as was originally intended, or is that not now required? And if you need more than 120 posts, will you take on more people? Thank you.
I think to take those one at a time, we've made a huge amount of progress in the time since we last met. I've already spoken about creating an engineering department. We've put in new business systems. We've dealt with the inventory that I took you to those warehouses in Westway by moving that locally, sorting through it. And although we found some problems, we've not found the showstopper that I was very concerned might be buried within that. We have changed working patterns to make a more efficient and also more employee-friendly arrangement in the work. We've introduced new planning systems. Yeah, the list is endless. We've effectively created a shipyard from a standing start in the space of a year. as a result, of all those changes in such a short time, it would be fair to say that there are teething problems as some of the processes fit together and we get the right information and the right equipment in the right place for the work. But overall, a lot of those process-based foundations and design-based foundations are coming to fruition. I think when we last met, I mentioned that we had about 5% of the basic design signed off by Flag, Class and owner. We're now north of 80% and working on the balance. So a great deal of progress made. With regard to parts of the ship built elsewhere, the vessels are being completed at Port Glasgow. There is a small amount that is being outsourced. For instance, the aluminium fabrication of the aft mast on 801 is about to go out to a subcontractor for a variety of reasons. But basically, the ships will be built and finished here. Some elements of the scope of work, like some of the pipe fitting and cable pulling, are being outsourced, but that was always in our plan. As far as employment is concerned, my concern, frankly, is that we won't be able to get the 120 people we need for the weekend shift. But rather than if we need more, can we get them? We will recruit to whatever level is necessary in order to be able to deliver the ferries. And we have the capability. I hope we have the capability in the labour pool to do it in Scotland. I've got to say I do worry that we need a lot of people and that the skills may not be available, but we are going to find out over the next few weeks.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Convener.
Colin, did that answer your questions on the labour recruitment? I'll allow you one question.
It would be good to know, because Mr Hale, you've obviously expressed concern about your plan, which was to recruit 120 qualified UK-based workers by mid-March. So are you on track to meet that? How far away are you from meeting that? And if you don't meet it, what is your contingency plan?
We announced the weekend shift last Thursday. So far, we have 31 expressions of interest. 15 of those have been checked and their skills fit what we require. The rest of them are going through the skilled assessment. I think, if I'm honest, I had never expected to get 120 on the 19th of March. There was always going to be a degree of ramp up involved. But it's early days, but with our recruitment partner, we're doing everything we can to make sure that it's strongly promoted around the Clyde so that people know where we stand. If we can't get the necessary number of people, then from UK-based workers, then once the travel restrictions for COVID are lifted, then we will turn outside of the UK either through subcontractors or through our direct employment and bring in overseas workers to complete the vessels. But I would stress my starting point is not just because of the COVID controls, because I have no other option, but my starting point is there should be, and we believe there's a pool of labour. We need to tap into it and find out what is available within the UK.
Thank you, Tim. And I think, Colin, you're happy with that answer. So I'd like to direct some questions specifically at the Minister. Minister, you wrote to the committee on the 19th of February saying that you wanted to bring Tim to this meeting to update us. You gave an undertaking in that letter that there would be a full update on delivery timescale and budget for 801 and 802 submitted prior to the parliamentary recess on the 25th of March. You stand by that commitment?
I think, Convener, we're obviously trying our best to get information to you. This is why we've brought here with us today to try and give you an update. I know that is what everyone is trying to achieve in terms of timing. It was obviously too early for the committee session. Sorry, it was too early to be able to provide that information, but that's still our intention. I haven't had an update on that from either Chris or Mr. Hare, but I'm assuming, unless they want to intervene, that we're still intending to meet that deadline.
Okay, so at this stage, Minister, I'll take it that you are committed to doing what you said in your letter. At this stage, do you know what the exceptional costs for COVID are in relation to this that was referred to by Tim Hare?
I don't have that figure to hand, Convener, but perhaps it might be best to direct that to
No, Minister, I'm asking you, if I may, please.
My answer is I don't have that figure to hand. We were obviously still working the basis at this moment in time, Convener, that the additional cost over and above the cost to CMAL will be 110 to 114 million, including the contingencies that Mr. Hare has just discussed with other members. So that is my understanding, that we're still living within that envelope of 110 to 114 million total cost. We have obviously provided some additional support to Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow in respect of the additional costs for tackling COVID. But that's
how much is that, Minister?
We can get you a figure for that, Convener. I don't have that in front of me, but we can get that figure. If you won't allow me to go to Mr. Wilcock to get that figure, I will get that to you subsequent to the meeting.
Minister, my question to you is that where we were on this contract is that we signed a contract for £97 million. We paid £82 million. We paid £15 million in loans. We've given a £30 million loan, and we've been told that there's £110 million of additional costs. That's £237 million for these ferries. Now, I would be surprised if I was in your position that I didn't have those costs at my fingertips. So I'm specifically asking you, do you have those costs to your fingertips, and do you have the slippage dates?
Well, can I firstly just correct the figures that you've outlined there? The cost to CMAL for the vessels will remain at the original project cost of 97 million. The additional cost, as I've just said, of 110 to 114 million provided Ferguson Marine from Scottish Government resources. That is not 237 million pounds, Convener. In addition to that, I've also stressed that my responsibility here is for the client side in securing the vessels. I'm here to discuss vessel procurement. I'm not responsible for the operation of the yard. That's dealt with by a different division of the Scottish Government, led by Ms Hislop as the Economy Secretary. So Mr Wilcock and Mr Hare will be aware of the figure there. That is not my responsibility. I'm responsible for the procurement of the vessels.
Well, Minister, with the greatest respect, the procurement of the vessels was a contract signed for £97 million. We have paid, as a country, £45 million in loans to the yard, and we're being told that it's going to cost us another 110 to 114 million pounds to get 801 and 802 delivered. Now, simple maths tells me that's 237 million pounds for those ferries. Now,
I have to take a position where I disagree with your analysis there. Clearly, I understand the 45 million pounds that you're referring to in terms of financial support provided to the previous operators of the yard, give them the working capital and also to allow them to diversify the business. I'm here to answer for the procurement of the ferries themselves. Ferries themselves are costing CMAL £97 million and will cost an additional 110 to 114 million pounds to finish. That is not 237 million pounds.
Okay, what's 45 million pounds in the big scheme of this? You would say, let's take it back to the equivalent of 180 million, more than double, well, 197 million actually, which is more than double the cost of the original ferries. So, Mr Wilcox, as the Minister's unable to give me that answer, could you tell me what the figures, the additional costs for COVID are for these ferries, or can Mr Hare tell me who's the right person to ask? I'm unclear.
I would pass those over to Tim in regards to those exceptional costs he mentioned earlier.
Okay, Tim, could you tell me what the exceptional costs are for COVID, please?
The exceptional that we published in August for the previous lockdown was 3.3 million. We have suspended production on the ferries, and that was for roughly 4 months of full lockdown. My CFO is working through the final figure for the recent suspension. but we suspended for 4 weeks, so I think it is going to be prorated down. So I'm not going to guess a number. I expect it to be very, proportionate to the 3.3 million for 4 months to length of time. I will happily write to the committee on no later than Monday of next week and give you a hard figure if that would help answer the question.
Okay. It would. And could you just also in that letter please confirm to me that you are absolutely clear there will be no slippage on the original times that were put forward to the committee for the deliveries of 801 and 802 when you took charge?
I'll address that in the letter, yes.
Okay. I have to say, just in passing, I find it very odd that we are talking a contract of this size when, and I make this comment to the Minister, that there is such amount of money involved in this that he doesn't have these figures to his fingertips. But
Convener, can I take exception to that remark? You are conflating two issues here. This is the COVID impact on the business, Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow, as a business which we are the owners of and we are supporting to come through COVID-19 pandemic, as other businesses are having to do. That is a separate issue from the costs of the contract that I am referring to. I have given you accurate figures. The cost, as I understand it, at this moment in time, for the delivery of the two vessels. So I would reject your criticism that I'm unable to provide a figure which is not related to the contract.
Okay, so it's another department. Angus, could you perhaps go with your questions now, please?
Okay, thank you, Convener. You'll be well aware, Minister, that during the course of our ferries inquiry we took evidence that suggested a dissatisfaction with CMAL's and to a lesser extent CalMac's community engagement, and we made recommendations to that in our report and called for better engagement. However, it's proud to say that both CMAL and CalMac claimed that they had a significant community engagement in the past. Now, you've mentioned the CalMac Community Board earlier, but given the concerns expressed, can I ask how you intend to give island and remote mainland communities a meaningful role in decisions on future vessel and ferry service specification and procurement?
Well, Mr McDonald raises a really important point, Convener. We certainly did take on board completely in the recommendations of the report that the need to improve our engagement strategy with the ultimately the customers of the ferry networks. And so Mr McDonald makes a really important point. We have been in the process of developing a revised communication and stakeholder strategy. That's one element of this, and that will continue to build on improvements with stakeholders, develop, hopefully we hope, greater transparency in how community views are received and included in our decision making, because that's been a challenge as well, the transparency about how community views have influenced design and why, where there have been variations from what communities wanted, why that was the case. I think we've not been so good at communicating ultimately why the design of a vessel ends up the way it is. So in vessel procurements, we continue to try and build on the positive engagement that's been started by CMAL, Transport Scotland and CalMac in relation to the Isle of Vessel project. I think I've mentioned in the debate, but there was been one event where there was 140 attendees in a virtual event to discuss the design of the Isle of Vessel. I got very good feedback on that from the chair of the CalMac Community Board, Angus Campbell, who's I should stress is a very effective chair of that board, and that's helped us to understand how we can improve processes there. And we are committed to continue to ensure that community views are taken on board. And obviously they'll have to be balanced at some points with operational and cost considerations, but I think we need to improve on how we explain how these factors are all mixing together. And I think also the point I made in the debate as well was regarding that ultimately some vessels, the design may reflect its need to provide a more wider resilience role. So it's not just for the route that we're going to spend most of its time delivering, but it may have to provide a backup role to alternative routes. Some design features may reflect that. But I hope that's helpful to Mr McDonald. I do recognise it's a very important point that the committee made in the report, and we fully acknowledge and accept we have to improve there.
Certainly glad to hear you've taken these issues on board, Minister, to coin a phrase. Communities will certainly appreciate that. If I could move quickly on to the issue of the propulsion systems in the vessels. Our inquiry also looked at that issue, and you've made some reference to it already today. But how do Transport Scotland and CMAL intend to make decisions on the most appropriate propulsion systems for new ferries, with a view to delivering the Scottish Government's net zero carbon commitments, particularly given the long lifespan of the vessels?
Yeah, again, it's a very fair question, and certainly the approach we're going to take to this is going to form a key part of the VRDP vessel replacement deployment programme moving forward, and we're looking at the lowest emission design and fuel types available. So we believe there's some significant savings that can be achieved through modern hull designs in themselves. So the Isla vessel, we're looking at potentially a new hull form, which could potentially save, I believe, and we checked with Chris Wilcock, but I believe in excess of 30% in terms of fuel savings. That, in addition, obviously looking at alternative fuels in terms of propulsion systems, could really make a huge difference. So that it will vary, of course, across different classes and sizes of vessel and routes in terms of the ability to save finance there. And obviously rechanneling that money back into perhaps being able to deliver more services to those who are served by the networks. And CMAL and Transport Scotland are also looking at, with other bodies, to replace their fleets to consider where lessons and synergies can be shared. So, for example, those operating internal ferry routes in Orkney and Shetland or in Highland Council area can perhaps benefit from any learning we are undertaking as part of our own thinking, and we would be happy to share that with others. But the Islands Connectivity Plan will also investigate the opportunities and technologies available in the maritime sector and set out pathways towards delivery of vessels that will operate with either zero or significantly reduced carbon emissions. And as I said earlier on in response to John Finney, I believe the Small Vessel Replacement Deployment Programme will be looking specifically at whether any of the up to 8 vessels could be using battery operated technology because of the nature of the short haul routes that they have to deliver. But I don't know if Mr. Wilcock would want to add to what I've said there, with your permission, Convener.
Yeah, Minister, again, I would just echo your points there. The savings from hull forms are encouraging, but looking at the marine technologies and emerging low carbon fuels is a key piece of work for my team. As the Minister has indicated, we're looking to do that with other partners, not only in the ferry sector, but working with other parties such as the Northern Lighthouse Board, who are kind of setting up groups on this with other parties across Scotland, building on some of the work we've done around COVID in that space as well. Looking, I think particularly we have pipelines of vessels such as small vessel replacement, starting to build into our thinking what happens over a 10-year time frame. If technology is approved, how do we adapt those systems, and also looking at retrofitting down the line, which may or may not be an option in some cases, but just building that into our thinking at that stage. So very much the focus of the work around these vessels at the moment.
Okay, thanks. It would be good to get more information on retrofitting. That would be helpful. And can I just make the point, Convener, that while options are being considered here, electric ferries are being deployed in Scandinavia. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Angus, and noted. Jamie, you've got some questions.
I do. Thank you very much, Convener. Good afternoon now to the Minister and his team. I've got a number of questions I'd like to ask, so if I could ask for fairly kind of concise answers, if that's okay. And I just wanted to start very briefly, actually, on what we've just spoken about. The Cabinet Secretary for Transport highlighted to this committee that the targets on low emissions had gone backwards because of the purchase of the Northern Isles ferries and freight boats. And I was just wondering if anything can be done to those, or are there any plans to do anything to those boats to make them more efficient, because obviously that they are not low emission ferries, and in fact there is which you may be able to confirm, that there is a concern locally that they are fairly fuel unfriendly vessels.
Well, certainly, Mr. Halcroft-Johnson, we could certainly come back in more detail on this in due course, but the freighters that you reference recognise that these are vessels that are in scope for allocation of the £580 million that we've announced in the infrastructure investment plan. So those are, within that total, there's about £281 million doomed between 21-22 financial year and 25-26 financial year in terms of voted loans for new vessel investment through CMAL. That's the way the funding tends to cycle through, is through voted loans. And within the scope of that, amongst other projects, is the consideration of Northern Isles freighter. So I know Kevin Hobbs and the team at CMAL are looking at what kind of design options there would be for that to perhaps provide. I'm sure at the point recognises as someone who's got strong connections to Orkney, that to ensure that we have as resilient an operation when vessels are in for their annual maintenance overhaul, to make sure we've got some perhaps additional passenger carrying capacity as part of the freighter redesign. So that's something we're actively looking at, and obviously we can come back to Mr. Halcroft-Johnson on the emissions aspects of those vessels, which I appreciate are needing to be addressed.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. A couple of other questions, and I'll maybe bring this all into one. Would you consider extending the duration of the future Clyde and Hebrides and Northern Isles ferry service contracts, allowing operators to plan and implement long-term capital investment plans? And also, could you set out the scope and timetable for the review of the current tripartite arrangements for the delivery of Scotland's Lifeline ferry services, and how you might include, as was mentioned earlier, communities, but also external ferry experts in that review?
Sure. I've touched on some of this already at the second point, so I'll try and just focus on things I haven't already covered. Certainly when it comes to the duration of the future CHIFS contract and the Northern Isles ferry service contracts, I do recognise the point that Mr. Halcroft-Johnson makes about obviously the longer the contract, the more able the contractor is to recover their investment and to have certainty of revenue as well to do that. So we've always been clear that a decision on the future approach to the procurement of, particularly of the Clyde and Hebrides contract, including the possibility of making a direct award, which I know is something Mr. Finney has been anxious to push for, to a public sector operator, would be taken ahead of the expiry of the current contract in October 2024. We can obviously consider this, but we will need to, as I alluded to earlier on, take into account the outcome of the BEIS consultation on the subsidy control mechanisms, so that we are staying on the right side of the law in that respect. And obviously that consultation ends at the end of March. So hopefully we would see an output from that from BEIS reasonably soon after that, which would help inform government decisions around if that might influence any recommendations around the message coming out of the review, the tripartite review, which he also referenced. So obviously, as I mentioned earlier, the consultants are going to have an initial meeting this week on that tripartite review. I've talked about the focus of that review earlier. I hope we can very, very shortly give an indication as to which contractor that is, and to allow them to start to engage, have a bit of auspices about what they're doing to engage with stakeholders around the tripartite review. But we can perhaps convener, given that Mr. Hare is going to be writing early next week, it's something that we could confirm in writing the contractor and maybe the details of the scope of the review next week, if that would be helpful to Mr. Johnson, Halcroft-Johnson and others.
Thank you, Minister. Yes, that would be. Jamie, I think you've got one brief question, and then we're going to go to Emma Harper.
Very, very brief. Thanks, convener. Yes, I was just wondering for the Minister if you could just give us a very brief update on any discussions with the Northern Isles councils on fleet replacements for the internal fleet, and also what role you would see Ferguson's playing in any procurement process for that.
Obviously, we are having continued discussions with the both councils, and indeed with, as you'd also mentioned, for completeness, the Highland Council and Argyll and Bute Council, although their needs are not in the same magnitude as Orkney. I would fair to say that Orkney Islands Council's capital investment requirements across ports and harbours, as well as vessels, is very significant. There are targeted investments required in Shetland, in Fair Isle and in respect of Walsey, two particular routes that are keen to, Shetland Islands Council is keen to invest in, the Corran Ferry in Highland Council, and smaller vessels that require replacement in Argyll and Bute Council. These are ongoing discussions where obviously, and I don't make this point to be in any way difficult, technically they are currently the responsibility of the local authorities, but we do recognise that we can obviously, as I said in a previous answer, share expertise in terms of helping them with future design as we can pass on messages we've learned around propulsion systems, fuel savings, obviously have a big bearing on the cost effectiveness of the ferry services themselves and their efficiency. And we will continue to engage at both official and ministerial level with those councils. We had productive discussions with the Finance Secretary, myself, and the leaders of and chief executives of Orkney and Shetland councils recently, and I would assume those discussions will pick up after the election and see what we can do to support those councils. But at this moment in time, we don't have any specific investment proposals, but we are engaging in detailed discussions around outline business case, the business case for both those councils, and we're expecting further detail, I think, from Orkney Islands Council in due course.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks, Jamie. And go to Emma. I think you're going to try and roll some of your questions up, but let's see how you go.
Thank you, Convener. I will do my best, actually. Good afternoon, Minister. A couple of questions about the Islands Connectivity Plan. In the development of the Islands Connectivity Plan, our briefing has a number of bullet points outlining what the scope of the plan could include. Are you able to provide a timeline or a timetable for the development of the ICP and what its scope would include, like vessel design? I know there's port infrastructure upgrades that are required and also community involvement as well, but you've responded to that as a response to Angus MacDonald's question. So an update in the ICP, please.
Sure. Thank you to Emma Harper for that question. The Islands Connectivity Plan will obviously replace the current ferries plan for those who are following the session and not familiar with that by the end of 2022. It will be developed within the policy context provided by the ongoing National Transport Strategy and National Islands Plan, which are themselves aligned to the Scottish Government's purpose and national outcomes, so they feed into the family of target measures that we have through the national outcomes and government purpose. It'll be closely linked to the current Strategic Transport Projects Review, which I'm sure colleagues will be aware, the first phase of which has been published, the second phase later this year, led by Mr Matheson. And in order to consider island connectivity more broadly, we have specifically included the regard to aviation, ferries and fixed links, and to connecting and onward travel as well, which is critical for those who are alighting on the mainlands to have onward connectivity, and obviously those travelling to islands similarly. So the plan will include a long-term programme of investment in vessels and ports, developed with the support over the next 5 years of the £580 million that I mentioned earlier. That was announced on the 4th of February by Mr Matheson, part of the Infrastructure Investment Plan. And I can't give more detail on that, or we can supply it subsequently if that would be helpful in the interest of time to the committee about the specific issues that are being covered in that £580 million, which I've mentioned a couple of already. And we do plan to engage with stakeholders to determine each island's needs for transport connectivity. So we recognise that no two islands are necessarily the same and their needs are different, including potential further service or capability enhancements or investment in vessels and ports. And that feeds into the standardisation point that Mr Finney mentioned earlier on, and also trying to, in the round, understand to the extent to which the harbour infrastructure needs to be adapted to support that kind of objective. And the plan will also analyse how services can achieve greater integration, as I say, with the wider transport network, improving travel choices, both residents and visitors, as well as encouraging and promoting economic growth. And I would add, because of the engagement we have with the MAX committee, the need to try and take into account the needs of those who have mobility issues. And we've had a recent announcement today, in fact, of some further grant funding to support accessibility issues on the transport network. The other thing I would just mention for the benefit of the convener and yourself, Ms Harper, is that following the evaluation of the RET, the evaluation of RET, and looking at the future fares, that will be also something that we will look at in terms of fares policy, including freight fares as part of the Islands Connectivity Plan as well.
Emma.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Minister. Is the £580 million part of the long-term financial planning for the ICP, or would a long-term financial plan have a separate funding commitment?
I think it's important to stress, the £580 million is purely an allocation and infrastructure investment plan the next 5 years. Obviously, the Islands Connectivity Plan may have a longer timescale, looking beyond any kind of messages or indication of direction of travel, no pun intended, as to beyond that period, if we're looking at the wider combination of aviation, ferries, onward travel connections and fixed links. So the 580 million does cover that. I should stress that 580 million does not include the additional costs that I mentioned earlier in response to the convener, around 110 to 140 million. So these are new projects, both harbours and vessels, that we will undertake over the next 5 years. So it's a significant commitment, but it is not the only commitment. We'll be looking, obviously, try and plan for the future and make sure that we have a pipeline in place to support the growth of the supply chain as well.
Okay, thank you.
And John Finney, I think you have a couple of questions you'd like to ask. John.
Indeed, thank you, Convener. A number of the matters have been covered by the Minister. Minister, it's just if I could maybe ask you a little bit more, please, on the Island Connectivity Plan with regard to fares policy. You briefly alluded to it, but could you maybe outline for the committee how wide-ranging that would be, indeed whether you envisaged any fundamental changes, and whether that would involve the inter-island ferry services in the Northern Isles, please?
Well, certainly we are looking at how we can address the needs of the Northern Isles. I mean, it's true. The vessel replacement deployment plan, we're also looking just as a separate document to try and expand that into looking at the needs of the Northern Isles as well. I mentioned in response to Mr. Halco Johnson already, we're looking at the replacement of the freight ferries to the Northern Isles as well. So I hope that gives Mr. Finney confidence that we are very much looking at the future investment needs of both networks, not just the Clyde and Hebrides, which is obviously the bulk of the ferry operations. In terms of the fares policy, we've obviously had a recent evaluation of RET, which has thrown up some interesting messages around the impacts that RET has had. In vast majority of cases, it has to be said, a positive impact for island communities. There are a number of communities, such as Bute is one example I can recall from reading the report, that there had been more of a mixed message and there have been some negatives. Clearly, the trade-off between deck space, between visitors and local community themselves using or having access to that deck space is something we need to consider. So we are going to take a look at ferries fares. Clearly, with a principle, we wouldn't want to make any communities worse off. I should stress that's our starting point, but it's more about what more we can do to help support communities and to support economic growth of communities in a sustainable way. I should stress. Through fares policy. And freight fares is a very tricky area. There are potentially, if we were to take a very blunt approach to applying the ferry fares in respect of freight, could have some very detrimental impacts in some communities. So we have to tread very, very carefully there. But as I mentioned earlier, the key thing for us is understanding what the outcome of the subsidy control mechanisms is, or consultation that BEIS are undertaking, will say to us in terms of, does that change the landscape, or does it allow us to operate as we've been doing previously? That's something we can come back to. I don't know whether Mr. Wilcock, convener, can add any further detail to help Mr. Finney on that point.
No, Minister, I think you've covered all of this. I think I've just for clarity confirmed that although we will be producing the ICP to replace the ferries plan at the end of 2022, we will be delivering a lot of these pieces of work in the interim. So I'm just stressed we're not going to wait until 2022 until all of these pieces of work come to fruition. We'll be preparing these as we go along.
Can I thank the Minister, Mr. Wilcox, for that? I think RET would be a session in itself, so that's maybe for another day. That's me concluded. Thank you, convener.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks for saying that it probably is a session and it's for an entire committee meeting. That's RET. So I'd like to thank you, Minister, and your witnesses for taking part in this session, and I look forward to receiving the updated information that has been promised by you and Tim Hare, and a full summary as promised to the committee on the 25th of March of the cost. Now, our next meeting will be on the 10th of March, where we'll be speaking to the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Infrastructure and Connectivity, and we'll be looking to some SSIs. Thank you everyone for attending today, And that concludes committee business, and therefore I close the meeting.